Earl Dawson had not cried at his wife's funeral 3 years earlier. He stood at the graveside in his army dress uniform, buttons polished, hat level, and watched the casket lowered into ground that still held the frost of a late Kentucky March, and he did not cry. 37 years with Mabel. Not crying was not indifference. It was the only way he knew how to honor the size of what he had lost, standing at attention in front of it the way a soldier stands at attention in front of something too large to salute casually. He cried at Raymond's funeral. Not loudly, not in a way anyone sitting nearby would notice. But his eyes went wet in the back pew of First Baptist Church in Murphy, North Carolina, on a gray February Tuesday in 2019, and he let them stay that way for the length of the service without wiping his face. Raymond Earl Dawson, 74 years old. Former United States Forest Service Ranger, 31 years. Former part-time hunting guide. Lifelong bachelor. Found in the kitchen of his apartment in Murphy on a Saturday morning by his neighbor Margaret, who came to return a casserole dish and found the door unlocked and Raymond on the linoleum floor, the coffee maker still running, still keeping warm a pot that nobody would drink. The brothers had not spoken in 8 years. The reason sat between them the way an object sits on a table when neither person in the room will reach across to pick it up. Their mother, Edna Dawson, had spent her last 4 years in a care facility in Corbin, Kentucky, near Earl's house. Earl had handled the paperwork, the insurance, the billing arguments, the weekly visits that became weekly updates on a woman who no longer recognized either of her sons, but who smiled at the nurses and liked the window that faced the garden. He had held her hand through the last night in November of 2010, when her breathing changed and the nurses came and went quietly and the monitors did what they did, and he had been the one to call the funeral home in the morning. Raymond had sent money twice in the first year, both times without a note, just a check for $300. After that, the check stopped and the calls went unreturned. Earl had written a letter in his 3rd year of managing their mother's care, a letter written at 2 in the morning after a phone call from the facility that turned out to be nothing serious, written in the specific fury of exhaustion and abandonment that a man feels when he realizes the burden will only ever fall on him. He had sent it without sleeping on it. Raymond had answered it with silence, which was its own answer, and then 8 years had accumulated on top of the silence the way sediment accumulates at the bottom of a slow river. Now Raymond was in a box at the front of a church Earl had never entered before this morning, and the silence had become a permanent condition. The service had approximately 40 people, mostly older men who had worked the national forest lands with Raymond or under him over the decades. Several retired rangers who had driven 3 or 4 hours. A few hunting guides from neighboring counties who had used Raymond as a reference for local terrain. 2 women Earl didn't recognize, both in their 60s, who sat together in the 3rd pew and cried openly in a way that suggested they'd been closer to Raymond than anyone would have assumed from his reputation as a solitary man. A man in his 80s who sat alone near the center aisle, back straight, wearing a canvas coat that was old but clean, who turned out later to be Tommy Birch, Raymond's nearest neighbor out at Hazel Creek, a man who had driven 3 hours each way to be present. Nobody introduced themselves to Earl. A few people looked at him with the uncertain glance of people who half recognized a face but couldn't place it. The ones who knew who he was gave him careful nods, the kind that acknowledged the existence of complicated history without committing to any particular position on it. The minister spoke for 22 minutes. He spoke about Raymond's love of the mountains and his stewardship of the forest lands and his quiet generosity toward people he trusted. Earl listened to all of it and absorbed none of it. He was thinking about a summer in 1963 when he was 17 and Raymond was 13, and Raymond had spent an entire Saturday afternoon sitting motionless on a creek bank watching a water thrush work the shallows. Their father had eventually stopped at the bank on his way back from the equipment shed and looked at Raymond sitting there for 2 hours and said, without condescension, "That boy is the quiet kind of smart." He had meant it as the highest compliment in his vocabulary. Afterward, in the parking lot, with the casket being loaded and the line of cars forming for the graveside, the attorney found Earl. Hank Pruitt was 55, Graham County Estate Attorney for 22 years, the kind of man who wore a suit that fit well enough and drove a truck that needed washing and had the directness of someone who had conducted 1,000 difficult conversations after funerals and had learned that efficiency was a form of kindness in these situations. He shook Earl's hand with 2 pumps and held it for a moment before releasing. "Mr. Dawson, you're listed as sole beneficiary in your brother's will. I'll need about an hour of your time before you head back north." Earl looked at the hearse pulling out of the parking lot. He looked at the line of cars forming behind it, the cars of 40 people who had known his brother in ways he hadn't. "Tomorrow," Earl said. "I'll come by in the morning." "Fair enough." Pruitt handed over a business card, plain white, his name and number and address. His office was on Main Street, 5 doors down from a hardware store. No reason to be anywhere else in a town this size. That night Earl stayed at the motel on the highway edge of Murphy, the kind of place that had a vending machine, humming in the hallway, and a television that got 7 channels with varying clarity. He ate crackers and peanut butter from the travel bag he'd packed in Corbin 2 days ago, because he hadn't thought to stop for dinner after the service, hadn't thought about food at all, until he was sitting in the motel room with his dress uniform hanging on the back of the bathroom door, and his shoes off, and the television off, and nothing to look at but the ceiling. He sat in the single chair by the window and watched headlights sweep across the ceiling from the highway and thought about his brother. Raymond had been the younger one by 4 years. He'd been the one who could name every bird by call and by sighted distance, who knew which mushrooms you could sauté in butter and which ones would bring a full-grown man down in 6 hours, who could spend a week in the backcountry without running out of things to occupy his attention. Their father had said the quiet kind of smart. Earl had been the other kind. The kind who talked first. The kind who signed up because it seemed like the right thing to do when you were 19 and Korea was happening. He had gone away and come back different. Gone away again and come back more different still. 3 years in Korea, 2 tours in Vietnam. 20 years in the Army total, stationed in 4 countries, promoted 7 times, ending at Sergeant First Class in 1979, with a Purple Heart from a firefight in Quang Tri Province in 1968, and a piece of North Vietnamese shrapnel embedded in his left knee that the Army surgeons at Walter Reed had examined twice, and each time concluded was safer to leave than to remove. He'd come back to Corbin for good in the fall of 1979. He'd married Mabel Henderson 3 years earlier, during a stateside posting, and she had waited out his second Vietnam tour in Corbin with a patience that he had never fully understood and had tried his whole life to deserve. They'd had Dennis in 1968 and Carol in 1971 and had raised them in the house on Maple Street that he still owned, the house with the apple tree in the backyard that Mabel had planted in 1982 and that still produced small yellow apples every September. He had been a postal carrier for 26 years after the Army. He had carried mail in Corbin rain and sun and ice. He had retired at 65 and spent the next 13 years doing the things that retired men do when they live in the same house they've always lived in and their children have moved away, and the yard is manageable, and time is a thing that accumulates rather than depletes. Raymond had never left. He'd done 3 years of forestry school in Asheville and come straight back to the mountains. Worked for the Forest Service in the Nantahala and the surrounding districts his whole career. Retired in 2007 at 62 with a small pension. Had the apartment in Murphy and the family cabin on Hazel Creek, which their father had built in 1947 and which Raymond had been the one to keep up, since Earl had stopped coming after their mother got sick and the visits became logistically complicated, and then the letter happened and the silence settled in. Earl had not fully understood his brother's choice to stay. He had respected it, the way you respect a thing you can observe and acknowledge without comprehending its interior logic. But he had never gotten close enough to see it clearly. Now Raymond was in a box, and Earl was in a motel chair, and the closest he could get was sitting with what he'd lost before he understood it. Pruitt's office smelled of old paper and coffee kept on the burner past the point of usefulness. A secretary who was quite possibly also Pruitt's wife showed Earl to a wooden chair and brought him a mug of coffee without asking how he took it. He drank it black, which was how he always drank it. "The estate is simple on the surface," Pruitt said, opening a manila folder. "No spouse, no children, no outstanding personal debts." He had a checking account with $12,400 and a small savings holding another $3,200. A 2006 Jeep Cherokee with approximately 180,000 miles on it, which the dealership in town tells me is worth maybe $3,500 in its current condition. His apartment contents are modest by any measure. He was not a man who accumulated possessions at home. He turned a page. Then there's the real property. Cabin and 47 acres on Hazel Creek, Graham County. Your family has held it since 1947. Property taxes were paid consistently through 2018, but the account fell delinquent for the 3 years after that. Graham County placed a lien on the property in December. The outstanding balance with accumulated interest is approximately $22,000. Earl drank his coffee without speaking. He had expected something like this. I had a real estate man go out and look at it about 3 weeks ago, Pruitt continued. Gordon Wallace, he handles rural properties in this part of the county. He submitted an estimate of $35,000 to $45,000 depending on buyer motivation. Mountain hunters and certain outdoor recreation types look for that kind of remote acreage occasionally. But after you satisfy the lien, you're looking at somewhere between $13,000 and $23,000 before commission and transfer costs. It is what it is. Earl looked at the mug in his hands. It was ceramic, with a hairline crack along the handle. Mabel had had a mug like this. She'd used it for 6 years after the crack appeared because it was the one her sister had brought her from a trip to Vermont, and she said a crack that didn't leak didn't disqualify a mug. There's one additional matter, Pruitt said. He opened the desk drawer and set a small white envelope on the blotter between them. Raymond brought this in personally about 6 months ago. He said if he passed away before he had a chance to take care of something himself, this should accompany the property documents. He was specific about one thing. He asked me to make certain that you received this personally, Mr. Dawson. Not your estate, not your children. You. He marked it that way in the will, and he said it to me in this office. Earl set down his coffee. He picked up the envelope. His name was on the front in Raymond's handwriting, which was the same handwriting as their father's, the same tall slanted letters with the lowercase e that curled back on itself. Earl had not seen Raymond's handwriting in 8 years. He had almost forgotten what it looked like, and then he saw it, and it was exactly as he remembered, which was not surprising, but felt surprising anyway. He did not open it in Pruitt's office. He put it in the breast pocket of his jacket. He shook Pruitt's hand, thanked him for the coffee, and walked out into the February morning. He sat in his truck in the parking lot for a while before he started the engine. His F-150 was 10 years old, paid off, mechanically sound. He had driven it from Corbin to Murphy in a day and a half, stopping overnight in Knoxville. He thought about whether to drive back today. Dennis called while he was sitting there. He had known his son would call. Dad, how was it? Earl considered the question from several angles. Fine, he said, which was not a complete answer but was the most accurate short one. You heading back today? Earl looked at the mountains through the windshield. The ridgeline was gray-brown in February, nothing growing on it yet, the hardwoods all bare, the sky behind them the particular white that February in the Southern Appalachians produces, not overcast exactly, just full. I want to go out to the cabin first. Dad. The tone that Dennis used when he believed Earl was about to do something impractical. It was a careful tone, engineered to sound like concern while functioning as correction. There's no point in going out there. The man said the property isn't worth much of anything. You'd be spending half a day and a tank of gas to look at something you're going to sell anyway. I haven't decided to sell. The lien is $22,000. Where are you going to find that? Earl started the truck. I'll figure something out. Dad, I'll call you tonight. He drove west out of Murphy on Route 74, then turned south toward Fontana. The road narrowed as it went. The curves got tighter. The guardrails appeared only occasionally, and when they appeared, they were old enough to be decorative. He hadn't driven this road in 23 years, and he found that his hands remembered the curves before his eyes told him they were coming. He stopped at a gas station in Robbinsville and bought 2 sandwiches wrapped in wax paper and a bag of peanuts, and asked the woman at the counter about road conditions down toward Fontana. She looked at him with the expression that people in small towns give to older men who are about to do something inadvisable without understanding they are being inadvisable. The back roads down by the reservoir? She said. They're passable if you've got 4-wheel drive and you're not in a hurry. Had a lot of rain last week. There'll be mud. He told her he had 4-wheel drive and he wasn't in a hurry. You know you have to get across the water to reach Hazel Creek, she said. Betty Sorrells still takes people across when she's willing, which is most of the time, but not guaranteed. He thanked her and drove south. Betty Sorrells was at the Fontana Village Marina, which was technically closed for the season in February, but which Betty appeared to treat as more of a suggestion than a standing operating procedure. She was 67, built from the same material as the dock pilings. with short gray hair and hands that knew their work and eyes that calculated the amount of trouble you were likely to cause before you'd finished your first sentence. Earl told her he needed to get across to the Hazel Creek landing, to the old Dawson property. She looked him over. "You're Raymond's brother." "Yes, ma'am." She looked at the sky and then at the water. The reservoir was flat and dark in the February light. "I heard Raymond passed," she said. "I'm sorry for it. He was a good man. He paid his dock fees on time, and he never left trash. You'd be surprised how many people make those two things difficult." She named her price, $30 cash, and said she'd need him back at the landing before 4 o'clock because she wasn't running after dark in winter water. He paid her. They crossed. The aluminum boat made a small amount of noise against the flat, cold reservoir. Earl sat in the forward position and watched the far shore approach. The mountains came down to the water on all sides, their reflections on the surface exact until a gust broke them. He thought about the last time he'd made this crossing. Dennis had been 9 years old, sitting right here in the front with his hand dragging in the water until Mabel told him to stop. Carol had been 6 and had sat in Mabel's lap the whole way. That had been 1996. 23 years ago, and the boat and the water looked unchanged. Betty ran them across without conversation, which suited Earl. She put him off at the small wooden dock at the mouth of Hazel Creek. She told him the trail to the Dawson property was a quarter-mile up the left bank and that she'd return at 4. He walked the trail slowly. His left knee had its own opinion about uneven ground, and the creek trail was as uneven as trails get. Roots crossing the surface at every angle, rocks pushed up through the soil by 50 years of freeze-thaw cycles, low spots where the creek had recently been higher and left mud behind. The February woods were stripped down to their structure. He could hear the creek running to his right, clear and cold. He could hear a pileated woodpecker hammering somewhere up the ridge to his left. Nothing else. The cabin came through the trees the way things from your past always appear when you've been away long enough. All at once, and smaller than you remember. Not diminished. Just correctly sized against your actual memory instead of against the memory of how it felt to be smaller. His father had built it in 1947 from poplar logs he'd cut from the property, using the help of a man from Bryson City who knew how to fit logs without gaps. 1 room plus a sleeping loft. A covered porch on the creek side. An ironwood stove with the patina of decades of use. An outhouse 30 feet back into the tree. A hand pump at the corner of the porch, the kind that draws from a spring buried uphill, cold and reliable in all seasons. Raymond had added something that Earl didn't recognize from his last visit. At the back corner of the cabin, connected by a covered wooden breezeway perhaps 12 feet long, stood a separate outbuilding. Poplar, same as the cabin, same age of weathering on the exterior, a metal roof that was newer than the walls. 20 feet by 20 feet, Earl estimated from the outside. The door was solid and heavy-looking, with 3 padlocks on heavy-gauge hasps bolted through the door and the frame with carriage bolts rather than screws. Someone had thought about this door with the specificity of someone who intended it to stay closed. Earl stood in front of the outbuilding for a moment and then went to the main cabin first. The door was unlocked. He pushed it open. Inside, the cabin was clean. Not recently cleaned, not scrubbed down for company. Clean the way a place is when someone has always kept it that way, when cleaning is not an event but a continuous condition. A single iron bed frame with a bare mattress covered with a folded wool blanket at the foot. The wood stove with a supply of split wood stacked beside it in a pyramid arrangement. A pine shelf along the east wall holding a cast iron skillet of the heavy old kind, 2 enamel mugs, a coffee pot for cans of beans, a box of salt crackers, a small bottle of cooking oil, a kerosene lantern on the plank table, a 3-legged stool. Against the far wall, a wooden crate being used as a bookshelf, holding a collection of field guides arranged spine out, a set of Forestry Service manuals from the 1980s, a worn paperback copy of a Patrick O'Brian novel, and at the end of the row, pushed slightly forward from the others, a Bible with a black cover gone soft at the corners. Earl stood in the middle of the cabin for a while. He looked at the field guides. He picked up the Bible. The envelope dropped out of it and landed on the plank floor. He picked it up. He already knew what it was. He'd been carrying the one from Pruitt's office in his breast pocket all morning, and this felt identical in weight and thickness. He opened it. 3 keys on a steel ring, each one different from the others, each one heavy and solid and clean. No rust. Raymond had been lubricating the mechanisms. And behind the keys, folded once, a piece of ruled notebook paper with Raymond's handwriting on it. Earl, when you're ready. I'm sorry about everything. Mama too. I'm sorry I left you alone with it. The gunroom is yours. All of it. Everything I built. Don't let anyone sell it until you've seen it yourself. You'll know what to do. Your brother, Raymond. Earl sat on the stool. He read it 3 times. Then he folded it and put it back with the keys in his shirt pocket. And he built a fire in the wood stove because Raymond had left the wood stacked for exactly this purpose, had organized the cabin precisely so that whoever arrived would find what they needed in the right place. He sat by the stove while the cabin warmed. He ate one of the sandwiches from Robbinsville. Outside, the creek ran, and the woodpecker hammered somewhere up the ridge. He thought about 8 years. He thought about the letter he'd written at 2 in the morning in the 3rd year of managing their mother's care, and sealed before morning and mailed before he'd had the sense to read it cold. The letter had been accurate in some of what it said, which was the true part of the grievance, and intemperate in the rest of it, which was the part that had made it unsealable in terms of a response. Raymond had not been able to answer the fair accusations without tacitly endorsing the unfair ones. He had gone quiet instead, and Earl had read the quiet as confirmation of everything he had written, and then the years had stacked up. He had thought about that letter many times in 8 years. He had thought about it in the way that a man thinks about something he cannot take back, but cannot stop reviewing, looking for the formulation that would have let him say the accurate things and leave out the rest. He had never found it. The accurate things and the unfair things had been too close together in his anger at the time to separate cleanly, and he had not separated them before he sealed the envelope, and the damage from that had been permanent in the specific way that silence makes things permanent. Raymond had written, I'm sorry about everything. Mama too. I'm sorry I left you alone with it. 10 words for the years their mother had needed managing and Raymond had stayed away. Those 10 words acknowledged the debt without qualification or excuse. He had not written I didn't know how, or I thought you had it, or I had my own situation. He had written I'm sorry I left you alone with it, which was the accurate statement, the one that would have begun to repair things if he had written it 8 years earlier. Earl thought about why he hadn't. About the specific difficulty for a man like Raymond, private by nature, of writing an acknowledgement to a man who had sent him a letter full of anger, some of it warranted and some of it not. The anger would have to be addressed, and Raymond would not engage with anger. He would wait for the anger to resolve itself, or he would wait until there was no time left to wait. There had not been enough time. Raymond had waited until 6 months before he died to arrange the communication that stood in for the letter he had never written. Earl looked at the 3 keys in his palm. He thought about Raymond here in this cabin, sitting on this same stool at this stove on winter mornings over 40 years, drinking coffee and organizing his thoughts and planning the next drive along the back roads. He thought about what it required, internally, to do that work alone for 40 years without a witness, without anyone to tell, without the validation that most people need before they are willing to keep going. He thought about what kind of person can build toward a thing for 4 decades without knowing whether the person they are building it for will be around to receive it. The kind of person who trusts that the important things arrive when they are supposed to arrive. The quiet kind of smart. He thought about what Raymond had been building in that room. He picked up the 3 keys and went to find out. The first padlock was a Medico, the kind used on commercial facilities where security is not a theoretical concern. It opened smoothly on the first try, which meant the mechanism had been maintained and the key had not sat and used for years. The second lock was a master commercial grade. The third was an older padlock, heavier, the kind made before weight reduction became a manufacturing priority. All 3 opened without resistance. Earl pulled the door open. The smell that came out was cool and specific. A faint chemical cleanness that he would later learn was the smell of archival materials combined with metal, underneath something older and drier, the particular smell of aged paper and preserving oil and time. The air temperature inside was noticeably lower than the February outdoor temperature, which made no sense until he stepped through the door and his eyes adjusted and he found, mounted along the left wall, a propane-powered climate control unit with a display panel showing 58 degrees Fahrenheit and 45% relative humidity. A small propane tank sat outside the far wall, connected through a sealed pipe fitting. Raymond had run a power line from a small solar panel array on the south-facing metal roof to a battery bank that powered the display and control circuitry. He had built a climate-controlled archival storage room in a hunting cabin on Hazel Creek in Graham County, North Carolina. Earl stood in the doorway and let his eyes work the room. Floor-to-ceiling shelving along the back wall and the right wall, the shelves built from dimensional lumber and braced carefully at regular intervals. On the shelves, archival boxes of various sizes, each one labeled in Raymond's small, precise handwriting. Some boxes were the gray-green of professional acid-free archival storage. Others were ordinary cardboard boxes that Raymond had fitted with acid-free liners and labeled in his careful hand. Earl counted the boxes in the first 2 sections of shelving, 43. He did not count the rest. On the central wooden table, padded with folded army blankets, lay 2 items arranged for examination: a small leather-bound book and a compass in a leather case, both clearly awaiting someone's attention. Along the right wall, a series of flat storage drawers built from the same lumber as the shelves, each drawer approximately 4 feet wide and 3 feet deep and 4 inches tall, stacked 6 high, running the length of the wall. The kind of drawer arrangement used for storing maps or large documents or oversized prints. Along the left wall, above the climate control unit and running to the far corner, a system of padded wooden pegs from which firearms hung, each one separated from the next by at least 6 inches of clearance. Earl counted them from the doorway without moving his feet. 32. Rifles and muskets and pistols of various ages and designs. Some of them were clearly old in the way that antiques are old. The proportions wrong for modern manufacture. The metalwork done by hand at a pace that no machine could replicate. Some of them were so old that Earl, who had carried weapons his entire adult life, could not immediately place their period. In the far corner, 3 wooden crates sat side by side, nailed shut. Each one stenciled with Raymond's name and the Murphy Post Office Box address in black paint. They were large crates, the kind built for shipping things that could not be allowed to shift in transit. Earl walked into the room. He stopped at the table and opened the leather case holding the compass. Inside was a brass compass, small enough to sit in a palm, its case fitted by hand from leather that was dry but intact. The mechanism had been cleaned and maintained. A small card in Raymond's handwriting sat on top. E.T. 1781. Continental Army. Survey Instrument. Cherokee Campaign Provenance. He set the compass down carefully. He walked to the shelving and opened a box at random. Inside, wrapped in acid-free tissue paper, lay a packet of documents held together with a cloth ribbon. He could see the top sheet was a handwritten letter on paper that was discolored with age. He put it back without disturbing it. He walked to the flat drawers and opened the top one. Inside, under a sheet of clear glassine paper, lay a map drawn on heavy paper, hand-lettered, the ink faded to brown at the edges. He could make out a river system and place names in a script that suggested the 18th century. He closed the drawer. He stood in the middle of the room for a while. The climate control unit hummed. Outside the door, the covered breezeway admitted a thin February light. He did not know what he was looking at. He was a retired Army sergeant and a retired postal carrier from Corbin, Kentucky, who had spent his retirement years watching college football and maintaining the yard and driving Carol's kids to their activities when she visited. He knew nothing about historical artifacts, about the antiques market, about what any of these specific objects might be worth. What he knew, standing in this room, was what he'd learned in Vietnam about terrain. When something didn't match what you'd been told, you needed to update your understanding of the situation. The room in front of him did not match anything Gordon Wallace had told him about the properties. Value. He went back to the cabin and sat on the stool by the wood stove. He called Carol. His daughter picked up on the 4th ring, her kitchen sounds in the background, something being stirred. "Dad, how was the service?" He gave her the brief version of the service. Then he said, "I'm out at Raymond's cabin. He left me a collection of things in a storage room attached to the cabin. Old objects. A lot of them. I don't know what to make of what I'm looking at." "What kind of old things?" "Firearms. Very old ones. Maybe 30 of them. And shelves full of boxes with documents and objects. Maps. Old papers. A table set up for examining something. 3 large wooden crates." Silence on Carol's end while she processed this. "How much is there?" "The room is 20 feet by 20 feet. Floor to ceiling. He built it himself, and he installed temperature and humidity control in it." Another pause. "Dad, do you have any idea what it might be worth?" "No. But Raymond spent his whole career building it, and he stored it like it was something that mattered. Before Dennis arranges to sell the property, I'd like to find out. She was quiet for a moment. There's a woman in Asheville named Janet Marsh. Before we find out what happened next in the story, I want to take a brief moment to speak directly to anyone watching who might be going through their own sudden, overwhelming transition. If you are navigating a bitter divorce, the loss of a spouse, or a financial shock, you know the hardest part isn't just the money. It's not knowing what to do first. That is exactly why we created the Phoenix Blueprint. It is a practical, step-by-step guide for starting over. It doesn't have fluffy affirmations or vision boards. It is a tactical survival manual. It gives you the exact checklist for the first 48 hours, including the one rule you must follow. Do not make any decision you cannot reverse. It includes the Found Money worksheet, showing you exactly how to check state databases because 1 in 7 Americans actually has unclaimed money waiting for them right now. It even gives you word-for-word boundary scripts to use when family members pressure you for money or try to make decisions for you. You can get the entire guide right now for just $17. If you're watching on your TV, just pull out your phone, open your camera, and scan the QR code on the screen right now. If you're on a computer or phone, click the top link in the description. You don't have to figure this out alone. Now, let's get back to the story. She works at the Folk Art Center there. She knows the antique and historical artifact world as well as anyone in this region. Let me find her number. She called back in 30 minutes with the number. Earl wrote it in the small notebook he always kept in his jacket pocket, a habit from the army. He had carried a pocket notebook for 50 years and filled perhaps 200 of them. He called Janet Marsh. She answered on the second ring with the practiced efficiency of someone who answered phones in a professional context all day. He explained what he'd found as specifically as he could, reading from notes he'd made while in the room. When he described the firearms, she asked him to slow down and describe 4 of them in physical detail. He did so, describing the lock mechanisms and barrel shapes and stock styles as accurately as his observation allowed, which was fairly accurate, given his background. She was quiet for a moment when he finished describing the 4th one. "Mr. Dawson," she said, "I would very much like to come and look at this collection in person. Can that be arranged?" He said yes. He said he would need to coordinate a boat crossing, and she should plan to start early. She arrived in Murphy 2 days later, driving a Subaru wagon that had done considerable mileage and had been loaded for the trip with 2 large canvas equipment bags and a rolling cart stacked with reference volumes. She was 52, tall, dark-haired, dressed practically without being casual, and she had the particular manner of someone who had trained themselves not to react visibly when they encountered something remarkable, because visible reactions in her line of work created complications. They crossed on Betty Sorrell's boat in the early morning. Betty assessed Janet's equipment bags with a brief look and said nothing beyond collecting her $30. Janet said nothing about the cabin exterior, said nothing about the covered breezeway. When Earl opened the 3 padlocks and pulled back the heavy door, she stepped inside, set both equipment bags on the wooden table, and stood still for a period of approximately 30 seconds, looking at the room. Then she said, "I see." She put on cotton gloves. The first firearm she examined was a long rifle hanging near the center of the right wall, approximately 4.5 feet from butt to muzzle, maple stock with a brass-mounted patch box, the lock mechanism a flintlock, the barrel octagonal. She turned it in her hands twice, reading the label on its peg mount, then took 12 photographs from various distances and angles, and then took from her bag a reference book with bookmarked pages and spent 5 minutes comparing the rifle against photographs in the volume. "Mr. Dawson," she said, still looking at the rifle. "This appears to be a Kentucky long rifle from the 1770s or early 1780s. Pennsylvania manufacture, based on the lockwork and the stock carving technique. The label on the mount states it traces to the Battle of Kings Mountain in 1780 and documents provenance to the estate of Captain Thomas Shelby of the Overmountain Men." Earl looked at the rifle. He had carried an M16 in Vietnam in conditions where his life depended on the weapon's function and had treated it accordingly. This rifle was something different from a tool. It was a document. "How do you verify that claim?" he asked. "We look at the documentation trail," she said, already moving to the next rifle. "Raymond would have assembled records. That's what the boxes are for. Let's find the relevant file." They found it in a box on the second shelf labeled in Raymond's hand. "Firearms documentation, Kings Mountain." Inside the box, in individual acid-free sleeves arranged chronologically, were 14 pages of records that Raymond had assembled over what appeared to be a span of approximately 20 years. A receipt from a Virginia antique dealer dated 1989, noting the sale of one Kentucky long rifle to Raymond Dawson for $340 and citing the item's known previous owners. A photocopy of a passage from a 1934 history of the Overmountain Men that referenced the Shelby family estate and itemized contents. An auction catalog from 1963 in which the rifle appeared as a lot, with a notation that it had been pulled before sale at the request of the consignor's heirs. For letters exchanged between Raymond and the Virginia dealer over a period of 2 years, establishing the provenance chain with increasing specificity. And then 12 pages of Raymond's own research notes, handwritten in his small, precise script, citing primary and secondary sources and documenting each link in the chain of ownership from the Shelby estate to the rifle's presence in his collection. Janet read the research summary without speaking. She set it down and looked at the rifle mounted on the wall. There are 3 documented examples of King's Mountain provenance in private hands, she said. The last one to come to auction was in 2016. It sold for $1. For $1 million. Earl sat down on the stool in the corner. That is one rifle, Janet said. She looked at the 31 others arranged on the wall. I need more time. She took 4 days. Not 4 working days with defined deliverables at predictable intervals. 4 days the way a person moves through something they have built their professional life toward, with the specific focus that excludes everything exterior to the task. Earl understood that kind of concentration. He had experienced it in the field during his second Vietnam tour, the particular attention that came over him when he was reading terrain that did not match what he had been briefed to expect. All the irrelevant information dropped away. The relevant information stepped forward with a clarity that was almost like a change in light. Janet Marsh moved through the gunroom that way. Everything that did not tell her something about the objects in front of her ceased to exist for the duration. He gave her the room and stayed out of her way. The first full day, she worked through the firearms systematically, taking each piece down from its peg mount one at a time and moving through the examination protocol she had established for herself. Physical inspection. Photograph sequence at 6 defined distances. Comparison against the reference volumes she had brought. Then a documentation check, locating the relevant archival box from Raymond's labeling system and reading through the contents with the specific patience of someone who has learned that the documentation tells the story the object cannot tell for itself. For some pieces, the documentation was dense. The King's Mountain rifle file ran 14 pages, each page citing specific sources, each source referenced in a chain that Raymond had been assembling for 20 years. For others, the documentation was a single receipt and 3 pages of preliminary research notes that Raymond had marked with a notation reading incomplete. Requires further research. He had used that notation 5 times in the files Earl had seen, always accurately, always in cases where he had identified something worth examining but had reached the limit of what his own resources could determine. He was not overreaching. He was flagging what he did not know. Earl found that more reassuring than anything else in the room. In the late afternoon of the first day, Janet called him out of the cabin to look at something she had taken from the wall. It was a pistol, small enough to sit in one hand, less than a foot from grip to muzzle, the lock mechanism worn from use and age, but complete and intact, the barrel engraved with a decorative pattern that served no functional purpose. She held it carefully in cotton gloves and told him it appeared to be one of a matched pair. She showed him Raymond's documentation, which cited both pistols as having belonged to a Continental Army officer from Virginia whose name appeared in multiple histories of the Yorktown campaign, and which noted that the matching pistol was held by the Virginia Historical Society, which had been trying to locate its partner for 40 years. He asked her if that made the pistol more valuable or less. More, she said, with the directness of someone who prefers not to oversimplify. A matched pair authenticated and documented is substantially more significant than either pistol sold independently. The Virginia Historical Society has been trying to complete this pair since 1984. Raymond's documentation is very good on the provenance chain up to 1963. There is a gap between 1963 and his acquisition in 1994. Closing that gap will be the specialist's work. She showed him Raymond's final note on the pistol, dated 2003. I believe I have the matched piece. If I am correct, the pair is complete for the first time since 1894. I have not contacted the Virginia Historical Society. I will leave this to whoever comes after me to resolve correctly. Earl set the notes back on the table and said nothing. The second full day, she worked the archival boxes on the shelving. She did not attempt to open every box. Opening every box would have taken weeks. She worked from Raymond's labeling system, which was specific enough to let her identify by period and category, and she opened boxes selectively when the labels suggested particular interest. She read through the materials inside with cotton gloves and the portable field lamp she had carried in one of her equipment bags, moving at a pace that was not fast and was not slow but was steady, the way a person moves when they are not trying to finish but trying to understand. She called Earl in twice on the second day. Once to look at a set of letters she dated provisionally to the 1780s, part of a correspondence chain she would need to research before she could say what they were. The handwriting was dense and formal, the paper brown at the edges in the way of documents stored without acid-free protection for a very long time. Once to look at a mariner's compass in a turned wooden case, English manufacture she believed from the mid-18th century, which she set on the examination table and added to the specialist list she was building. The third full day, she reached the flat drawers. He was on the cabin porch when she called him in, just after noon. She was standing at the open third drawer with the glassine cover sheet folded back and the portfolio of watercolor studies laid out on the padded wooden table under her portable lamp. She looked at him when he came through the door and said simply, "There is more here than I expected." He looked at the watercolors spread on the table. Mountain light, valley rivers, the specific quality of late afternoon in the Southern Appalachians where the light comes through the gap in a ridge at an angle and turns. Everything it touches gold for a period of 40 minutes before the ridge takes it again. Raymond had found 11 of them at an estate sale in Tellico Plains, Tennessee, for $85. The whole folio. But that was not what she was talking about. She had set 3 drawings apart from the portfolio on a clean section of the padded table. Pencil drawings on separate sheets, smaller and faster than the watercolors, with color notations written in the margins. Thumbnail compositional sketches of the kind a painter makes in the field before committing to a full study. Each one had a notation in pencil in the lower right corner, and she pointed to it with her gloved finger, initials and a date in the 1850s. She said, "I need the Whitredge specialist from the Smithsonian to come to the site. I am not comfortable working from photographs on these. The additional material changes the assessment substantially." He asked her what she could tell him at this stage. She said, "I can tell you that your brother understood what he was looking at when he bought this folio. He paid $85 for materials that represent a discovery of genuine significance to American art history. Whatever he believed was in this room, the evidence supports him." The fourth day she compiled, photographed, and inventoried. She walked the entire room 3 times with her camera, documenting each section. She examined the climate control installation with close attention, photographing the panel settings, the propane connection, the battery bank, the solar array on the south-facing roof. She spent 40 minutes examining the 3 large paintings that had come out of the wooden crates, looking at the canvas backs, the stretcher bar markings, the evidence of age in the frame joints and lining materials. Before she left, she sat at the cabin table with Earl and told him what she was going to put in her preliminary report and what she was not yet prepared to put in writing. She said, "In 31 years I have encountered 3 collections that changed my understanding of what rural estate sales actually contain. This is a 4th. Your brother understood something that most people in my field have not internalized despite working in it their whole careers. He understood that historical objects do not stay in historical places. They move with families. They get separated from their documentation. They end up in the back rooms of old houses and the corners of barns and the shelves of antique shops where nobody who comes through has the specific knowledge to recognize them for what they are." He drove the back roads of this region for 40 years because he believed these objects were out there waiting, and he found them because he was right and because he was patient enough to look until he did. Earl said he was. She said, "I want you to know that what he built in this room is not only valuable in the financial sense. It is historically important in a way that monetary value does not fully describe. These objects should have been studied and preserved and understood properly. Because of your brother, they are going to be." She left that afternoon on Betty's boat. Earl stood on the dock and watched the aluminum boat move out across the flat, gray reservoir until the distance made it too small to resolve against the water. Then he walked back up the creek trail at his usual pace and sat on the porch without going inside for a long time. Earl stayed in the Murphy Motel and drove out to the cabin each morning, crossing on Betty's boat at 7:30. He built a fire in the wood stove and brought sandwiches for both of them for lunch. In the afternoons, while Janet worked through the room methodically, he sat on the cabin's porch or walked the creek trail at the pace that his knee allowed and thought about what his brother had been doing out here for 40 years. Raymond had not told him. Not once. Not even in the years before the silence, when they had still spoken occasionally by telephone at holidays and had exchanged brief letters after their father died. Raymond had never mentioned the storage room, had never mentioned driving to estate sales, had never mentioned that he was building something. Earl thought about why. He turned it over the way he would turn over a piece of terrain in his memory, looking for the approach that made sense. Raymond had not been secretive by nature. He had been private, which was a different thing. Secretive people hide things because they fear exposure. Private people simply do not require an audience for the things they care about most. Raymond had been building something that didn't need witnesses during its construction. The point was not the process. The point was the finished thing. He had wanted Earl to see the finished thing. That was what the keys in the envelope were. On the second day, Janet opened the flat drawers along the right wall. The top drawer held a survey map on heavy period paper, hand-drawn, dated 1762, the cartographer's mark in the lower right corner indicating British colonial survey work in the Appalachian region. The second drawer held a collection of letters and documents, the paper and ink consistent with the late 18th century. The third drawer, when Janet pulled it open and set aside the glassine cover sheet, held a large folio of watercolor sketches. Mountain landscapes. A valley with a river running through it under specific afternoon light. A gap in a ridgeline with the sky behind it painted in a way that made the light appear to come from a source rather than simply from above. Janet held the fourth watercolor under her portable field lighting for 18 minutes without speaking. She said, "Raymond acquired these at an estate sale in Tennessee. Do you know which one?" Earl did not. They found the documentation box the following morning, on the fifth shelf, labeled Watercolors, Tennessee Acquisition, 1993. Inside was a receipt from an estate sale in Tellico Plains, Tennessee, a folio of mixed artwork, purchased for $85, and Raymond's research notes, running to 14 pages of handwritten analysis documenting what he had subsequently discovered about the watercolors' likely origin. He had identified them as preliminary field studies by Thomas Worthington Whitredge, a painter associated with the Hudson River School who had made a documented tour of the Southern Appalachians in the 1850s. Raymond had found the relevant exhibition catalog in the UNC Asheville Library, compared compositional elements and the documented color palette against reproductions in the catalog, and concluded with what he described as reasonable confidence that the studies were authentic. He had written to 2 museum curators. Both had responded with cautious, non-committal letters that acknowledged the interest of his query without committing to an assessment. He had continued researching. His final entry on the watercolors, dated 2014, read, "I believe these are genuine. I am not the right person to say for certain. I have done what I can with what I have. The rest belongs to someone who knows more than I do." Janet put down the notebook. "The 11 watercolors," she said carefully, "will need to go to the Smithsonian American Art Museum for authentication. They hold the primary Whitredge collection. But I can tell you that these field studies are consistent with his documented approach and his known palette from that period in a way that will be very difficult to explain as coincidence." She was quiet. 8 authenticated Whitredge preparatory studies have sold at auction in the past 20 years. The highest sale was $2, $3 million, for a single sketch. On the third afternoon, they opened the crates. The 3 wooden crates in the corner had been built by hand from 1-inch pine, nailed shut with finishing nails at regular intervals. Earl used a flat pry bar from Raymond's tool shelf along the cabin breezeway wall and worked each nail loose methodically, setting the lid aside without damaging it. Inside the first crate, paintings, large works on canvas, each one wrapped first in cotton cloth and then in a layer of acid-free tissue, packed within a frame of wooden battens to prevent pressure on any surface. Earl lifted the first painting out with both hands and leaned it against the shelving wall. It was a mountain landscape, heavy forest in the foreground, the trees painted with a density of detail that required you to stand close to see individual branches and then step back to see the mass as a whole. Above the forest, a gap in the ridgeline, and beyond it a sky painted in a way that made the light appear specific rather than general, as though the sun were in a particular position at a particular time of a particular afternoon rather than simply shining as a concept. The paint was heavy in the foreground and dissolved into something thinner and more luminous in the sky. It had the quality of having been painted by someone who had stood in this place in this specific light and worked quickly to capture it before the light changed. Earl had no vocabulary for painting. He knew this about himself. But he knew, with the part of his brain that had been trained in Vietnam to recognize when terrain had a quality that differed from the terrain around it, that this painting had been made by someone working at a level he had not encountered before. He could feel the difference without being able to name it. Janet looked at the painting for a long time. She went to her reference books, opened 2 of them, found pages she had apparently pre-marked. She came back to the painting. She took photographs from 6 distances. She examined the back of the canvas. She stood at 3 feet and looked at the paint surface through a small magnifier. Then she walked to the far wall and looked at the painting from 15 feet. She said, "Mr. Dawson, sit down for a moment, please." Earl was already sitting on the stool. He told her so. She looked at him. She looked at the painting. She said, "I need expert analysis before I say anything I would stake my professional reputation on. What I can tell you is that this painting has characteristics that are strongly consistent with the work of Frederick Edwin Church. The color temperature in the atmospheric zone, the compositional approach to the foreground-middle-ground transition, the technique of the sky treatment." Church made tours of several southern mountain regions in the late 1850s and 1860s. Some of those tours produced documented bodies of work. Others remain incompletely accounted for. Raymond's documentation will be the key. Can we find it? They found it. The box was on the top shelf, labeled Crate Paintings, Acquisition and Research Notes, 1998 through 2007. Inside, Raymond's notes covered 19 pages in his small, precise script. He had purchased 3 large canvases at separate estate sales over 9 years. The first in 1998 from an estate sale in Macon, Georgia, held following the death of a woman whose family had owned the painting for at least 3 generations. He had paid $400 and noted that the family believed it to be a landscape by an unknown regional painter. The second in 2002 from a farm estate sale in Rossman, North Carolina, where it had been stored in an outbuilding behind glass, $175. The third in 2007 from an antique shop in Elizabethton, Tennessee, whose owner had acquired it from a house cleanout and had no documentation, $600. Raymond's subsequent research filled the remaining 15 pages. He had spent years examining the physical characteristics of each painting against reproductions of Church's authenticated work available in library volumes and museum catalogs. He had written to the Olana State Historic Site in Hudson, New York, which preserved Church's estate and archive, in 2010. He had received a brief response acknowledging his inquiry and noting that the staff could not provide authentication. Assessments from photographs alone. He had continued his analysis independently, citing specific technical points: the thickness of the paint application in the foreground areas, the color mixing approach in the sky zones, the compositional structures that appeared across all 3 canvases and corresponded to compositional patterns documented in Church's authenticated Southern Mountain work. His final note on the subject was dated November 2015. "I have done what I am able to do. These paintings are either what I believe them to be, or they are very accomplished work by someone working in close imitation of Church's mature style, in which case the imitation would itself be historically significant. I cannot determine which is true from where I sit. I believe I know. I will leave proof of the knowing to the people who come after me." Earl read this paragraph twice. He looked at the 3 paintings now leaning against the shelving wall, the other 2 removed from their crates while he was reading. He set the notes down. He looked at Janet. She was looking at the second painting, a mountain river scene in which the afternoon light on the water had been rendered with a patience that made it seem like the painter had stood there until the light agreed to hold still. She said, "I'm going to contact Sotheby's American Paintings Department, and I'm going to contact Church scholars at 2 research universities. This process is going to take some time. She paused. But I can tell you this, Mr. Dawson. Whatever this collection is worth at its lower end, its upper end is a number that requires a different kind of planning than you've probably been doing. What does that mean? Earl asked. It means, she said, that you should retain legal counsel before you tell anyone else about this room. Do it this week. He called Dennis that night with the same message he'd been giving him all week. Still evaluating. We'll let you know. Dennis's patience was eroding at a rate that Earl could detect in the specific shortening of his responses. Carol called the next morning. Earl told her what Janet had found, without numbers, which he didn't have. Carol was quiet through the account, and then said she was coming up, and asked if there was room at the motel. There was. She arrived the following weekend, drove up from Nashville in her own car, stayed 3 days. She walked through the collection room without speaking for most of an hour. When she came out, she sat on the cabin porch with her hands wrapped around an enamel mug of coffee and looked at the creek for a while. Dad, she said, what do you think Raymond was doing all those years? What was he thinking? Earl had been thinking about this for days. He'd been thinking about it on the creek trail in the mornings. He'd been thinking about it in the motel room at night. He'd been thinking about it by the wood stove. He knew what he thought. He'd been deciding whether saying it out loud was accurate or sentimental. He had decided it was accurate. He was being patient, Earl said. He was doing the thing he was best at, which was watching carefully and waiting. He drove those back roads because he knew the history of this country better than most people, and he understood that the things people value don't stay with the people who know their value. They move. They go into the back rooms of old houses and the corners of barns and the boxes that get put in closets when the people who understood them die. And he was willing to drive until he found them. He had all the time he needed, and he was willing to use it. Carol was quiet. He said he didn't do it for money. He had the money he needed. If he'd wanted to sell things, he would have sold things. He did it because he thought these objects mattered, because he thought they were worth keeping properly. She said he did it alone. Yes, he never told anyone. Not even you. Not even me. She looked at the creek. Why? Earl thought about it. He said, I think he didn't need anyone to know while he was doing it. The work was its own thing. He wasn't building toward an audience. He was building toward a moment when it was finished enough to hand over. He gave me the keys when he knew the time had come. Carol put her hand on his arm for a moment. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Beverly Cross, the Asheville estate attorney that Pruitt had recommended and that Carol had confirmed was the right person, retained Earl at a reduced rate pending the outcome of the authentication process. She set up a formal meeting in her office in mid-March, by which point Janet Marsh had filed a preliminary report and the first specialist had been contacted. Dr. Paul Engstrom arrived from the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History in the second week of March. He was 53, a firearms historian, wore a canvas jacket with too many pockets, and traveled with a rolling bag full of equipment that he carried himself without asking for help. He had a manner that Earl respected immediately. He did not perform engagement, did not try to manage the situation by projecting enthusiasm or professional warmth, simply assessed what was in front of him with the same quality of attention that Raymond had brought to his own work. Earl noticed this and said nothing about it. On the first day, Engstrom took every firearm off the wall and examined each one individually, working from left to right. He spent between 20 minutes and 2 hours with each piece, depending on what he found. He used the magnifier in his jacket pocket, a portable light source, a small reference device he connected to his laptop, and a notebook in which he wrote in handwriting that was considerably worse than Raymond's, but equally purposeful. He did not narrate his process. He answered Earl's questions when asked and did not ask Earl to leave him alone, which Earl had offered and which Engstrom had declined by simply not responding to the offer and continuing to work. On the second day, Engstrom worked the documentation. He sat at the padded table and went through Raymond's archival boxes for the firearms methodically, reading each file against the physical examination notes he had made the previous day. He occasionally read a passage from one of Raymond's research notebooks out loud, not as a performance, but as though he needed to hear it spoken to assess it accurately. He stopped once and was quiet for a long time before writing something in his notebook. Earl was on the stoop when Engstrom came out at midday and said, "Your brother's documentation methodology is the most rigorous I have encountered in private collection work in my career." He cited peer-reviewed sources consistently. He identified gaps in the provenance chain accurately and without minimizing them. He filed everything in a logical system that lets me find exactly what I need when I need it. I have examined collections assembled by people with PhDs in American history who did not do this work this well. Earl said, he was a forest ranger. Engstrom said, I know. I looked him up when Janet Marsh called me. He paused. I want you to know that the quality of his research is going to materially affect the authentication timeline. Collections with this kind of documentation move through specialist assessment much faster than collections without it. He understood that the documentation was as important as the objects. He went back inside without waiting for a response. He spent 3 days in the collection room with the firearms and said very little during that time beyond the noon exchange. On the third day, he sat at the cabin table with Earl and laid out his findings in the methodical manner of someone who had testified before congressional subcommittees about the disposition of historical artifacts and had learned to be precise. The King's Mountain rifle was, in his professional judgment, authentic to its documented period and consistent with the provenance chain Raymond had assembled. The final confirmation would require additional research that he would complete at the Smithsonian, but the physical evidence was strongly supportive of the attribution. The matched dueling pistols were a pair of exceptional quality, and the provenance chain citing their connection to a Continental Army officer was credible, though it also had a gap he would need to investigate. The rifle with the Daniel Morgan attribution was complex. The piece itself was authentic to the period, but the provenance documentation had a known gap of about 20 years in the 1830s and 1840s. He would try to close that gap. The remaining 29 pieces ranged from significant to substantial regional collector interest, with a handful falling into a category he described as museum caliber but not unique. The 5 anchor pieces, he said, setting down his pen, represented a collection of documented American Revolutionary War-era firearms that was without parallel in private hands anywhere. He knew of 3 institutional collections that would compete aggressively for these items at auction. He estimated that a properly structured sale of the top tier alone, under the right conditions, with full documentation in place, would achieve somewhere between $12 and $20 million. He said the full collection would likely exceed that by a third to a half again. Earl wrote down $12 to $20 million. He looked at what he'd written. He looked out the cabin window at the creek. Dr. Miriam Okafor arrived from the Library of Congress in April. She was a document specialist, middle 50s, with the careful speech of someone who understood that precision mattered more than speed. She spent 4 days in the flat drawers and 2 days in the archival boxes that Raymond had labeled as containing correspondence and documents. She spoke about everything in terms of what the analysis would establish rather than what she currently believed. She said the 1762 survey map showed characteristics consistent with British colonial survey documents of that period and region, and that the cartographer's mark would need to be traced against known records. She said the correspondence collection contained approximately 40 letters and documents of various periods, all requiring individual examination and handwriting analysis. On her last morning, she told Earl that 3 letters in the correspondence collection were of particular interest. They appeared to be written by the same hand, and that hand appeared, to her initial examination, to be consistent with handwriting she had spent her career studying. She was not prepared to say more than that yet. He asked her who. She said she would not speculate in advance of full authentication. She said the Library of Congress would be very interested in discussing acquisition of the full document collection once authentication was complete. He thanked her. She crossed the reservoir on Betty's boat and drove back toward Washington. Betty came back across with Earl in the late afternoon. She said, the woman from Washington seemed satisfied with what she found. Earl said he believed so. Betty looked at the water. She said, Raymond came out here regular, right up until his health started going bad. 2 or 3 times a year, sometimes more. Always alone. Always came and went without telling me what he was doing out there, which I respected. He paid his way and didn't ask for anything he wasn't willing to pay for. Earl said, did he ever talk to you much? Betty thought about it. He talked about the birds mostly. He could tell me what was on the water before I had my eyes on it. And once in a while he'd talk about something he was reading. He read a lot. She paused. He never talked about anything he was working on. I knew he was working on something. You can tell. But he didn't offer it, and I didn't push. Earl said, that was the right instinct. Betty brought the boat in at the dock and cut the engine. She said, I hope whatever he built out there amounts to something that lasts. Earl stepped out onto the dock. He said it would. The Whitredge watercolors were authenticated in May by a specialist from the Smithsonian American Art Museum who had spent 15 years studying the artist's work and had co-authored the most recent catalog raisonné of Whitredge's documented output. She confirmed all 11 studies as authentic. Her preliminary estimate for the collection, based on comparable sales in the prior decade, was between $18 and $23 million. She noted that the Smithsonian would be interested in pursuing acquisition through appropriate channels. The 3 crate paintings required more time and more people. Sotheby sent 2 representatives in late May. Catherine Park was the senior specialist in American paintings, 47 years old, with the specific calm of someone whose professional life required her to assess very large sums of money without allowing the assessment to visibly affect her. Marcus Webb was a conservation specialist who traveled with a portable X-ray fluorescence analyzer, an ultraviolet lamp, a microscope, and a series of reference samples from authenticated church works that he had checked out from Sotheby's conservation lab. Marcus spent 6 hours on the first painting before speaking. He told Earl and Catherine that the pigment analysis was consistent across multiple sampled points, with the specific palette and medium composition documented in Church's authenticated canvases from the 1855 to 1870 period. That the ground preparation of the canvas corresponded to the preparation method documented in Church's authenticated works. That the underdrawing visible under ultraviolet light used a compositional approach that matched the approach documented in Church's authenticated preparatory studies. That there were no signs of modern restoration or overpainting in any area of the canvas that would indicate later alteration or replacement. Catherine Park, working in parallel, had been in direct contact with the Ohlona State Historic Site. She had sent them the photographs Janet had taken in February. The Ohlona archivist had forwarded them to 3 church scholars. All 3 had responded with substantial interest, and each had independently raised the same question. Was there a possibility that these represented work from churches documented, but poorly accounted for Southern tours of 1860 and 1861? The answer that was emerging, with appropriate scholarly caution that meant everyone hedged their language, but their meaning was clear, was yes. Earl sat on the stump outside the cabin in late May and tried to hold the accumulation of these findings in his mind the way a man carries something that needs to be carried carefully. 3 church paintings. 11 Whitredge watercolors, 32 historical firearms, the top 8 of which were among the most significant in private hands, 40 letters and documents, 3 of which might be something that neither Engstrom nor Okafor had yet put into words for him directly. Raymond had written, "Everything I built." He had built it for $14,000 over 40 years. Earl had added the purchase prices from Raymond's documentation boxes across 5 separate visits. The total came to $14,340 and some change. That was 40 years of Saturdays and back roads and stopping at estate sales in places whose names Earl had never heard, paying $85 for a folio of sketches and $340 for a rifle and $175 for a painting in Rossman, North Carolina. The weeks between late May and the 10th of June were the longest Earl had experienced in a particular way. Not the length of combat, which moved at the speed of a threat that never fully resolved. Not the length of grief, which had no predictable structure. This was the length of something coming into its final form, and the awareness that he was waiting for the form to declare itself. He had moved out of the Murphy Motel and into the rental house Beverly Cross had identified on Elm Street, a 1970s brick ranch with a carport and a small backyard and a kitchen that functioned. His furniture from Corbin was not there yet. He had not arranged to have it moved. He had bought a cot and a folding chair and a card table, and the kitchen had come with a coffee maker, and that was enough for the time being. Dennis called every few days. Earl gave him the same answer. Still in process. Nothing final yet to report. Dennis had stopped pressing after Earl had told him the preliminary estimates from each specialist, which he had done carefully and in sequence over several calls, not all at once, because releasing the information gradually seemed more humane than releasing it as a single dose. Dennis had taken each piece of information the way practical men take surprising information. He processed it against his existing model, recognized the model was wrong, and updated the model without a great deal of external acknowledgement that the update had occurred. He asked specific questions. He did not speculate beyond what Earl could confirm. He said he understood and then hung up and presumably went back to work, which was how Dennis had always handled things that required time to process. Carol drove up from Nashville twice during this period. She stayed for long weekends and was better than her brother at sitting with uncertainty, a quality Earl had always associated with her mother's side of the family. She drove out to the cabin with him and sat on the porch in the June warmth with coffee and looked at the creek and did not require anything from the situation beyond its simple facts. On her second visit, she brought a legal pad and made a list at the cabin table of everything that would need to be decided when the authentication was complete. The list had 37 items on it when she stopped writing. She taped it to the wall next to the kitchen shelf, beside the field guides, and told Earl that Beverly Cross probably had a separate list that was longer and more specific. He had been driving to the cabin 4 mornings a week. He walked the Hazel Creek trail most days, at the pace his knee permitted. He had bought proper trail boots in Murphy and was wearing them in methodically. The trail was good for thinking in the specific way that physical movement generates thought without requiring it. He thought a great deal about Raymond on those walks. He thought about the letter he had written in 2011. He had reviewed it in memory many times over the years, in the middle-of-the-night inventories that men conduct as they get older and the items on the list stop being abstract. The letter had contained accurate things and unfair things in the same envelope, and Raymond had received them as a single document because they arrived together and could not be separated once sealed. Raymond had not answered because answering accurately would have required engaging with the fair accusations and the unfair ones simultaneously, and Raymond did not engage with unfairness. He went quiet, which was its own kind of integrity and also its own kind of damage, and both of those things were true at once. Earl had been angry about the quiet for a long time. He had read it as abandonment. He was reading it differently now, walking this creek trail at 78 with the knowledge of what was in that back room. Raymond had refused to answer a letter that did not leave him room to respond accurately. He had gone quiet instead. And then 8 years of quiet had accumulated and become its own permanent condition. The condition only ended because Raymond had left keys in an envelope with a Corbin attorney, which was the only kind of letter Raymond could write after 8 years. The collection room was Raymond's answer. 40 years of Saturday drives and patient work, and the 10 words on the ruled notebook paper. You'll know what to do. It was a strange form of trust to extend to a man you had not spoken to in 8 years. Raymond had not known, in any verifiable sense, that Earl would handle the collection correctly. He had trusted it on the same evidence their father had gathered on the creek bank in 1963, watching a 13-year-old Raymond sit motionless for 2 hours, the kind of smart the other one was. Raymond had known Earl was the practical kind, the one who could be counted on to show up. He had trusted that. He had left 35 years of work to it. Earl intended to justify the bet. Beverly Cross called on the 10th of June. She had spent 3 weeks compiling estimates from each specialist, coordinating with Sotheby's, with the Smithsonian, with the Library of Congress, with the additional specialists who had been called in as the scope of the collection became clear to the people examining it. She asked Earl to be in a quiet place before she gave him the numbers. He was in the cabin. He told her so. She said the preliminary combined estimate, incorporating all authenticated and assessed items, was between $395 million and $510 million. Earl said nothing. She repeated the figure. She broke it down by category. The church paintings, she said, were the largest component. Sotheby's current consensus on auction estimates for the 3 canvases individually, $45 million, $62 million, and $78 million. Combined, $185 million. Based on Church's current market and the historical significance of an undiscovered body of Southern mountain work. The historical firearms, the top 8 pieces with documented Revolutionary War provenance, combined auction estimate from the Smithsonian specialists, $18 million. The remaining 24 pieces, for $2 million combined. The Whitredge watercolors, $21 million for the 11 studies. The historical documents. The Library of Congress had submitted a formal acquisition offer for the full document collection. Separately, Dr. Okafor had confirmed that the 3 letters she had identified as being of particular interest were in fact signed by Alexander Hamilton, dated to the period of 1791 to 1794, relating to the federal government's early engagement with the lands west of the Blue Ridge. These were the first Hamilton letters of this specificity to come to assessment outside institutional holdings in over 30 years. A specialist dealer in historical documents, brought in by Beverly Cross to provide an independent estimate, had assessed the three letters at between $48 million and $55 million. Beverly continued through the remaining categories: the colonial decorative arts, the numismatic collection, the additional documents not yet fully processed, the 11 other paintings and artworks in the 3 crates beyond the 3 church canvases, the archival boxes that had not yet been fully cataloged. She estimated the aggregate for these remaining items at between $70 million and $110 million, acknowledging that several of the unopened boxes might produce additional significant finds. Earl was looking at the coffee pot on the stove. It was the same coffee pot Raymond had left on the shelf. He had been using it every morning for 4 months. She asked him if he had questions. He said, "What about the lien on the property?" $22,000, she said, plus accumulated fees and interest since February. Currently approximately $24,500. He thanked her. He said he would call her the following morning. He set the phone on the table. He sat at the table for a long time. The afternoon light moved across the cabin floor the way it had moved across every floor in this cabin since 1947. He thought about Raymond in his one-bedroom apartment in Murphy with $12,400 in savings and a 2006 Jeep with 180,000 miles on it, sitting in Pruitt's office 6 months before he died and handing over an envelope for the attorney to keep safe. He thought about their father looking at a 13-year-old Raymond on a creek bank and saying the quiet kind of smart. He thought about Mabel on this porch in the summer of 1996 drinking coffee and saying this was the most beautiful place she had ever been, and meaning it without any awareness of what was stored in the outbuilding behind her. He got up and walked out to the porch. The creek ran well after a week of June rain. A wood duck worked the far bank. He watched it for a while. He sat on the porch step with his coffee and tried to hold Beverly's numbers in his mind as a factual reality rather than as something that had happened to someone else in a situation he was observing from a distance. The numbers were accurate. Beverly Cross did not make careless errors and did not round up and had told him to be in a quiet place before she gave them to him specifically because she understood the difference between a number that requires adjustment and a number that requires a different kind of attention entirely. $472 million. Raymond had driven back roads in his 2006 Jeep with 180,000 miles on it, stopping at estate sales in rural counties that most people drove through without stopping, paying $85 here and $340 there and $175 somewhere else, carrying his purchases back to Hazel Creek and wrapping them in cotton cloth and packing them in wooden crates he had built himself and storing them in a room he had built and climate-controlled with a propane unit and a small solar array, maintaining the system for years, without telling anyone what was in the room. And the result of that 40-year effort now sat in Beverly Cross's preliminary assessment at just under $500 million. The creek ran. The wood duck moved along the far bank, working the root structure for whatever the June rise had loosened. He thought about the back taxes. $22,000, rising to $24,000 with interest and fees by the time he had arrived at Pruitt's office. Gordon Wallace's estimate, $35,000 to $45,000, maybe, for the cabin and the 47 acres. Dennis's advice, sell, take the small net, let it go. His own first reaction, driving out from Murphy in February with his knee aching and his dress uniform in a bag in the back of the truck. I should at least see it before I decide. He had seen it. He had been seeing it for 4 months. He thought about what Raymond had written in the note. Don't let anyone sell it until you've seen it yourself. You'll know what to do. He had written that 6 months before he died. He had written it and sealed it in an envelope and given it to Pruitt with specific instructions that it reach Earl personally. He had known, 6 months before the end, that the time had come to arrange the transfer. He had known Earl would come to the funeral. He had counted on Earl's instinct to want to see a thing before making a decision about it. Raymond had known Earl for 74 years. He had known the specific way Earl was stubborn, which was not the stubborn of a man who refused to change his mind, but the stubborn of a man who insisted on gathering his own information before closing to a position. He had built the transfer around that. Don't let anyone sell it. You'll know what to do. Earl looked at the creek. He knew what to do. He called Dennis. Dennis answered on the first ring. He had been waiting. Earl told him the number. He said it plainly, the way you tell someone a thing that needs to be heard without embellishment. The phone was silent for longer than Earl had ever heard his son be silent. Dad. Yes. That's real. That's a real number. Beverly Cross gave it to me. She's careful about what she says. It's a range, not a fixed amount. But yes. More silence. Then, I told you the property wasn't worth anything. I told you to sell it. Yes, you did. I told you not to spend time going out there. You did. Dennis exhaled. It was the specific exhale of a man recalibrating something fundamental about how he understood his own judgment. Earl recognized it. He had made the same sound himself a few times in his life, in Vietnam, standing in terrain that had not behaved according to his expectations and coming to terms with the gap between what he'd assumed and what was actually there. Dad. His voice had dropped. I'm sorry. About the pressure I put on you. Earl said, you were being practical. I was wrong. You didn't know what was there. Neither did I. But Raymond knew. Dennis said this slowly, feeling his way through it. Raymond knew, and he trusted you to find it. Yes. Why you? His son was not being critical. He was genuinely asking. Earl looked at the creek. He thought about the note in Raymond's Bible. He thought about Pruitt saying Raymond had specified the keys go to Earl personally. I think because I was the one who would know not to sell it before looking, Earl said. Raymond knew that about me. He knew Dennis would look at the lien and the real estate man's estimate and make the efficient decision. He knew I would want to see it first. I would have sold it, Dennis said. Without knowing. Yes. For $35,000. Probably less, after the lien and the commission. The silence on the line had a different quality now. Not the silence of recalibration. The silence of a man sitting with what that would have meant. What happens to the collection? Dennis finally asked. What are you going to do with it? Earl had been thinking about this for weeks. He had been thinking about it on the trail in the mornings, and by the stove in the evenings, and in the motel room at night, when the highway traffic moved light across the ceiling. He said, the things that belong in museums are going to museums. The Hamilton letters, the survey documents, the most historically significant firearms. Those should be accessible to people. Raymond didn't collect them to keep them locked up. He collected them to preserve them until someone could do something better with them than keep them in a climate-controlled room in the mountains. He said, the paintings will go to auction. That's the right outcome for works of that significance. Auction puts them in the market where their value gets properly established and the institutions that should have them can compete. Dennis was quiet. The revenue from all of that will fund something permanent here, Earl said. A historical research foundation. Keep this property. Work with the national park and the university system. Make this a place where people can come and study the history of this region. Raymond spent his whole career as a ranger loving these mountains. What he built should stay connected to them. Dennis said, Mama would have liked that. Earl said yes. He looked at the creek. Dennis said, what about us? The family? There will be more than enough for everyone, Earl said. But that's not the point Raymond was making. If the point had been money, he would have sold things. He had 40 years to sell things. He was making a different point. What point? That what you build with patience and knowledge, and time ends up worth more than what you build with money and speed. Earl said it plainly. That's what he was showing me. That's what the room is. Dennis was quiet for a long time. Then he said, I want to come up. I want to see it. Come up, Earl said. Dennis drove up on a Thursday. He left Louisville at 5 in the morning and arrived before 10, which was how Dennis handled logistical tasks he had committed to. Early, efficiently, without requiring the situation to accommodate his schedule. He drove a Lexus that was impeccably clean, and he was 51 years old, and looked it in the way that competent professionals look their age, well-maintained rather than unchanged. He had his father's build and his mother's eyes, and he had spent 30 years becoming very good at things that were largely quantifiable. He had not been to the Hazel Creek cabin since the summer of 1996. He said nothing about the crossing on Betty's boat, which was not the category of transportation he typically encountered. He said nothing about the trail. He said nothing when the cabin came through the trees. Earl opened the 3 padlocks and pulled the heavy door back. Dennis walked in. Earl sat on the stool in the corner and watched his son work through the room the way he had once watched his best sergeants assess an unfamiliar situation, moving methodically, not touching anything, reading what was present before forming any conclusions. Dennis went to the archival boxes first and read the labels along the top 2 shelves from left to right. He went to the flat drawers and read each label Raymond had affixed to the face. He examined the rifle mounts on the left wall and read the small identification labels under each peg. He stood in front of the 3 church paintings, now rehung on the back wall after the Sotheby's assessment, and spent several minutes with each one. After nearly 2 hours, he came out of the room and sat on the covered breezeway steps without speaking. Earl went inside the cabin and put water on the stove. He came back out with 2 enamel mugs of coffee and sat on the opposite step. Dennis took the mug. He looked at the creek through the trees. He held the coffee in both hands and was quiet for a period that would have made most people uncomfortable and did not make Earl uncomfortable at all, because he had raised this boy and he knew that Dennis's silences were working silences, the kind that required patience from the other person rather than conversation. Dennis said, "The archival boxes." He labeled every one of those himself. Every one. And the climate control system. He installed that. He built the room and installed everything in it. He ran the propane line and mounted the solar panel and wired the battery bank himself. Dennis drank his coffee. He said, with some care, he did all of this alone. Yes, over 40 years. Starting in 1989 with the rifle from the Virginia dealer, yes. Dennis looked at the creek. He said, "I have spent my entire professional life building systems for managing complex projects. I know what it costs, in time and sustained attention, to build something that accumulates toward a coherent end over decades." He was quiet for a moment. "I built mine with a full team and a substantial infrastructure budget. Raymond built his with what was left after gas and groceries." Earl said nothing. Dennis said, "I owe you an apology, Dad. When you told me you were going to the cabin, I told you it wasn't worth the time. When you called every week to say you were still assessing, I thought you were being impractical. I thought the same thing I always think when something doesn't resolve quickly, which is that the failure to resolve quickly is a signal to cut the exposure." He looked at his coffee mug. "I applied the wrong analysis to a situation that didn't fit my model." "That happens," Earl said. "Not to me. Not this clearly." Earl looked at his son. He said, "It happened to me too. I spent 51 years not understanding what Raymond was building. Not the room. What he was. I didn't know until I walked through that door." Dennis held the mug in both hands. After a moment, he said, "He trusted you to do the right thing with it. He did. He could have left the keys to the attorney, or a museum, or the Forest Service. He left them to you." Earl looked at the creek. He said, "Because I was the one who would come. Whatever happened between us, Raymond knew that if it was important enough, he could count on me to show up. He built 35 years of work on that assumption." Dennis said, "He was right. He was." They sat with the creek and the coffee and the October cold for a while longer. He sat with Earl at the cabin table and drank coffee from the enamel mugs. He said, "I'm going to build something." Earl looked at him. "I don't know what it is yet," Dennis said. "But I watched Raymond build something over 40 years, and I've been watching you hold this thing together for 4 months. When I was telling you to give up on it." He looked at his coffee. "I've been efficient my whole life. I've been good at the practical calculation. What I haven't been is patient." Earl didn't say anything. Dennis said, "I'm going to find something worth being patient about." Earl nodded. He said, "That's enough." The Library of Congress acquisition of the full document collection, including the Hamilton letters, was completed in August for $52 million. The announcement generated coverage in outlets that Earl had never paid attention to before and that now appeared in his news feed whenever he opened his phone. Dr. Okafor called to tell him that the Hamilton letters would be mounted in a dedicated display case in the library's main reading room, with full attribution to the Dawson collection and a narrative panel explaining their provenance, including the estate sale in Brevard, North Carolina in 2001, where Raymond had purchased them for $40 from a family that had held them for at least 3 generations without knowing what they had. $40, Earl said. Dr. Okafor said. He found them in a box with other papers at a sale. He paid the asking price without negotiating. The family told him the papers had come down through a great-grandmother who had been the wife of a surveyor in the 1820s. The chain before that, we're still trying to trace. Earl thanked her. The announcement brought attention that Earl had not anticipated and had not wanted, which Beverly Cross had told him to expect, and which he had underestimated anyway. A reporter from the Washington Post called Beverly's office the day after the Library of Congress issued its press release. A correspondent from the Associated Press called the following day. The story, as it was being written in the coverage Earl encountered when he searched his own name for the first time in his life, was a version of the truth, but not quite the truth. It was the story of a veteran who discovered a hidden fortune in his brother's cabin, which was accurate as a summary and missed almost everything that mattered about what Raymond had actually done. Beverly helped him draft a short statement that he agreed to provide in lieu of interviews, which said what he wanted it to say, that the collection represented the life's work of Raymond Earl Dawson, former United States Forest Service ranger, who had assembled it over 40 years through careful study and patient acquisition, and that the primary purpose of the estate's administration was to ensure that the collection was preserved, authenticated, and made accessible to the public, institutions and researchers for whom it would be most valuable. He did not say anything about the $14,340. That was his information. He kept it. The coverage subsided after 2 weeks. The people who wrote about it moved to other stories, as they always did, because the story as a summary was complete and there was no drama left to report. What they did not report was the ongoing work, the cataloging still underway at the Smithsonian, the provenance research still in progress on 14 of the archival boxes, the architect's preliminary drawings for the research facility addition at Hazel Creek that Beverly was reviewing with the National Park Service, the conversations with 3 universities about affiliate programs that Carol was managing with a thoroughness that Earl had not asked for and was grateful for. The real story was the ongoing work. That was always the real story, and it was almost never the story that got reported. He drove to the cabin most days through August and September. He walked the Hazel Creek Trail in the mornings and sat on the porch in the afternoons and worked through the correspondence and the decisions that accumulated. He had bought a laptop in Murphy and was using it with a patience that would have surprised Dennis, who had given him a brief tutorial on email in 2015 and had concluded that the technology was beyond his father's interest. The interest was there when the work required it. He was learning the contours of what he had been handed, not the financial contours, which Beverly managed with competence and reported to him in monthly summaries he read carefully. The other contours, what Raymond had understood about each piece in the room, what the specialists were adding to that understanding, what the gaps were, and how they might be closed. He read Dr. Engstrom's full authentication reports as they arrived, which were dense with technical language he had to look up and cross-reference. He read Dr. Okafor's preliminary publication on the Hamilton letters, which cited Raymond's research notes as a primary source. He read the Whitredge specialist's draft catalog entry for the 11 watercolors, which described in careful art historical language what Raymond had understood in the practical language of a man who had spent his career paying attention to the natural world. He was making himself conversant in what Raymond had built, because that was what a trustee did, and he intended to be the right one. The Sotheby's auction of the 3 church paintings was held in New York in October. Earl did not attend. He had no interest in the room where the auction would happen, which he had seen described as a concert hall of competitive money, a phrase that meant nothing to him and seemed to mean everything to the people in the art world who wrote about it. He watched the live stream from the cabin. Carol sat beside him at the plank table. Dennis watched from Louisville and called them after each lot closed. The first painting sold for $51 million. Earl looked at the number on the screen. He looked at it for a while. The second sold for $68 million. Carol had her hand on his arm. The third sold for $81 million. The phone rang. Dennis's voice, different from how Earl had heard it in years. Not efficient, not practical, not managing the situation. Just his son, calling from Louisville, saying, "Dad." Earl said, "I know." He sat with the laptop screen showing the final bid results. He sat with the numbers. He thought about a farm estate sale in Rossman, North Carolina, in 2002, where Raymond had paid $175 for a painting that was leaning against the wall of an outbuilding. He thought about Raymond carrying it to his Jeep, about Raymond driving it 4 hours back to Hazel Creek, about Raymond wrapping it in cotton cloth and packing it carefully in a wooden crate he had built himself and stenciling his name and post office box on the outside in black paint and setting it in the corner of the storage room beside the other two. $200 million in 3 canvases, purchased for $1,175 total. He held that figure in his mind without trying to make it comprehensible, because it was not comprehensible in the way that a sum purchased at an estate sale is comprehensible. It was comprehensible only as the product of 40 years of paying attention in rooms that other people passed through without stopping. He closed the laptop. He sat in the cabin for a while in the October dark with the fire going, and he thought about what Catherine Park had said to him the afternoon the Sotheby's team had finished their preliminary assessment and was packing up to return to New York. She had been careful and professional throughout the assessment process, as her work required. But in the covered breezeway, pulling on her jacket before the walk to the dock, she had stopped and turned back to him and said, "I want you to understand something, Mr. Dawson. We see a great many things come through our assessment process. We see single remarkable objects occasionally. What we see almost never is a private collection assembled by one person over a lifetime that maintains this level of consistency and quality from the first acquisition to the last. Your brother was not collecting broadly. He was collecting towards something. Every piece in that room is connected to the others by a coherent understanding of what matters in American history before 1800. That takes not just knowledge, but conviction. He knew what he was looking for, and he knew why it mattered. That combination is rarer than any of the objects in the room." Earl had thanked her. He had not said anything else. He was thinking about that now, in the October dark. Raymond had known what he was looking for. He had spent 40 years looking for it and finding it, piece by piece, in the back rooms and the estate sales and the antique shops of the Southern Appalachians, and each time he had found something, he had brought it home and documented it, and stored it correctly, and kept looking. He had not stopped looking when the room was full. He had kept going, because the point was never the room. The point was the understanding that produced the room. Carol was still there. She made more coffee, and they sat without needing to fill the quiet with anything. He said, "I want Raymond's name on everything that comes from this." She said, "It will be. Beverly's already working on that." He said, "The foundation. The exhibition labels. Whatever institutions get established. Raymond Dawson. I don't want it to be the Dawson family. I want it to be Raymond specifically. His name. His 40 years. She said, "Yes." He said, "He trusted me to do the right thing with it. That's what I'm going to do." She said, "He picked correctly." Beverly Cross filed the final documentation for the combined collection valuation in November. The total figure, incorporating all authenticated items, auction proceeds, acquisition payments from the Smithsonian and the Library of Congress, and the assessed value of remaining items still being cataloged from the unopened archival boxes, was $472 million. She called Earl at the cabin. He was sitting on the porch. November had taken the leaves off the trees, and the ridgeline was bare, and the creek was running high from a week of rain. He could hear a red-tailed hawk somewhere on the thermals above the ridge. She said the number. He said, "Raymond paid $14,340 for everything in that room. I added it all up." She was quiet. He said, "He was a forest ranger. He bought gas for his Jeep and lunch at diners, and whatever was left at the end of the month went to estate sales. $14,000 over 40 years. She said softly. He understood what he was looking for. Earl looked at the creek. He said, "He did." In the month after the final valuation, Earl sorted through the house on Maple Street in Corbin, Kentucky. He had lived in the house for 37 years, first with Mabel and then without her. It was not a large house. 3 bedrooms, a living room with a fireplace that had been relined in 1995 and worked well, a kitchen that had been updated twice in 30 years, an apple tree in the backyard that still produced small yellow apples every September. He had known every room the way you know the rooms of a house you have lived in long enough to stop seeing them with any freshness. He worked through it the way he worked through most things, systematically, without sentimentality in the operational sense, which did not mean without feeling, but meant he did not allow feeling to stop the work. He kept what he needed, which was less than he expected. He gave Carol and Dennis their choice of whatever they wanted before he made other decisions. He donated to the Corbin Historical Society the set of Kentucky pottery Mabel had collected over their years, because Mabel had told him once that she hoped it would end up somewhere that appreciated it, and the Historical Society struck him as the right answer. He packed 11 boxes and drove them to Murphy. He sorted through Raymond's apartment in Murphy as well, which Pruitt had kept intact pending the estate's resolution. Raymond's apartment was exactly what Pruitt had described: modest, clean, the apartment of a man who did not use his home as a repository for the things he cared about. The books were field guides and forestry references, and a number of general histories of the Appalachian region. The furniture was simple, and had been chosen for function. The kitchen was organized with the methodical efficiency of a man who cooked reliably and without drama. There was nothing in the apartment that indicated what was in the storage room on Hazel Creek. That was the apartment of a man who had put everything that mattered to him somewhere else, somewhere it would be properly kept, and had returned to this apartment at the end of each day to sleep and eat and rest, and then go back to the work. Earl stood in the apartment for a long time. He boxed the books and donated them to the Murphy Public Library, which had a small local history collection that Raymond's forestry references would supplement. He kept one item from the apartment, a hand-drawn map that he found in the top drawer of the desk, drawn in Raymond's handwriting, showing the Hazel Creek watershed and the trails Raymond had maintained over 31 years. The map had notes on it in pencil, updated over time, marking changes in the trail conditions and the creek crossings and the locations of specific trees and points of wildlife observation that Raymond had considered worth recording. It was a working document, a record of how one man had known one piece of land over a working lifetime. Earl brought it to the cabin and hung it in the main room on the east wall, where it would stay. The Raymond Dawson Collection Foundation was established in January of the following year, incorporated in North Carolina, with Beverly Cross and a 3-member board of directors, including a historian from the University of North Carolina, Asheville, a representative of the National Park Service, and Earl himself as founding trustee. The foundation's mandate was the collection, preservation, and public accessibility of American historical artifacts from the Appalachian region, with a specific focus on the pre-revolutionary and revolutionary periods and the history of the Appalachian mountain culture. The Hazel Creek property was retained by the foundation. Planning began for a carefully designed expansion that would add a small research library and archival facility to the existing cabin, using materials and methods consistent with the character of the site. The National Park Service, whose jurisdiction surrounded the property, agreed to a cooperative arrangement that would allow for public programming, field research, and educational visits. Betty Sorrell signed on to operate the boat crossing as the foundation's formal transport operator, at rates more favorable to her than her $30 per trip arrangement had been, which she did not mention and Earl did not bring up. Tommy Birch drove down from his property at Hazel Creek when he heard about the foundation announcement. He sat on the cabin porch with Earl on a January afternoon and drank coffee from one of the enamel mugs. He said, "Raymond never said a word to me. 30 years we were neighbors, more or less. He'd come and go, and I'd see his lights from across the creek sometimes. We'd talk when we ran into each other on the trail. He knew everything about this watershed. He could tell you things about this creek and these mountains that weren't in any book, because he'd spent his career paying attention. But he never said a word about what he was doing in that back room." Earl said, "No, he wouldn't have." Tommy looked at the creek. He said, "I knew he was smart. You could feel it. The way he paid attention. The way he moved through this country. He always seemed to know something you didn't know yet. I just didn't know the shape of what it was." Earl thought about this. He said, "I think the shape of it was patience. He had something he was building, and he understood it would take as long as it took, and that was all right with him." Tommy nodded slowly. He said, "That's a harder thing to have than most people think." The Smithsonian's exhibition, found in plain sight, the Raymond Dawson Collection, opened in March. Earl went. He stood in front of the King's Mountain Rifle, mounted behind glass under controlled lighting, and read the label that Dr. Engstrom's team had written. It cited Raymond's 20-year research effort. It named the Virginia dealer. It traced the chain from the Shelby estate through 4 subsequent owners. It quoted from Raymond's research summary directly. "The Earth keeps things that people lose track of. That's not negligence on the Earth's part. That's fidelity." Earl had not known Raymond wrote like that. He stood there reading it twice. The exhibition room was full on a Tuesday morning in March. Families, school groups, individual visitors who slowed in front of each display case and sometimes stopped. He watched a woman in her 50s read the label for the Hamilton Letters display case 3 times. He watched a man in his 70s lean in close to examine the survey map and then pull his wife over to show her something on it. He walked through the entire exhibition. Raymond's name appeared on every major label, in some form, either in the attribution credit or in the provenance narrative. Beverly had made that a condition of the acquisition agreement, and the Smithsonian had agreed because the provenance story was itself historically important. A boy of about 10 stood in front of the King's Mountain Rifle with his mother. He looked at it for a while, and then said, "Is it real?" She read the label. She said, "Yes, it's real. Someone found it at a sale in Virginia and researched where it came from for 20 years. The boy looked at it again. He said, "Who?" His mother read the label further. She said, "A man named Raymond Dawson. He was a forest ranger in North Carolina." The boy accepted this information. He moved on. Earl followed at a distance and did not say anything. He went through the exhibition. Twice that morning. The first pass was systematic, moving in sequence from the opening panel through the firearms cases, the document displays, the decorative arts section, and the watercolors mounted behind glass on the long east wall. He was reading the labels the way he had been taught to read maps in the Army. Look for the whole picture before going to the detail. The second pass was slower. He stopped at the case containing the matched Continental dueling pistols. The Smithsonian had arranged a loan from the Virginia Historical Society so that both pistols could be exhibited together for the first time since their documented separation in 1894. The case label told the full provenance story. The Virginia Historical Society's 40-year search for the missing partner, Raymond's 1994 acquisition receipt from the Waynesboro dealer, the authentication process, the resolution. A docent standing nearby explained to a visiting couple that the provenance story was exceptional because the documentation was so specific and so verifiable at every link in the chain, which was rare in objects that had spent a century in private hands. He stopped longer at the Hamilton letters. They were mounted in a central case in the main hall, each letter displayed on its own archival mat, the handwriting visible at the appropriate viewing distance. A narrative panel beside the case told the story of the Brevard estate sale, the $40 purchase, Raymond's subsequent research and documentation, and his decision to wait. The panel quoted from Raymond's notes, "I am confident about what I am looking at. I am not the appropriate person to make the formal determination. I have tried to do the work that the appropriate person will need to do when the time comes." Beside the letters case, framed separately, was a photograph that the Library of Congress archivist had found in the institutional archive. Alexander Hamilton, around 1790, unposed, looking slightly off-center, with the expression of a man who had more to do than time allowed and knew it, and was doing it anyway. Earl looked at that photograph for a while. He thought about what it meant that a retired Forest Service ranger from Murphy had gone to an estate sale in Brevard in 2001 and paid $40 for a box of old papers and had known, from whatever accumulated knowledge had given him the ability to know, that 3 of those papers were significant, had taken them home and documented them with the same methodical patience he applied to every object in the room on Hazel Creek, had waited for the right moment without any certainty that the right moment would arrive. The right moment had come. It had come in the form of Earl driving from Corbin for Raymond's funeral and showing up at Pruitt's office the next morning because Raymond had planned for that possibility too. He drove back to Murphy the following day. He drove west on Route 74 and turned south toward Fontana and felt the road narrow under him the way it always did, the curves getting tighter, the guardrails appearing less frequently, the mountains rising on both sides in the particular way of a landscape that does not make room for you, but does not actively resist your passage. He crossed on Betty's boat in the late afternoon. He walked the trail. His knee made its usual complaint on the roots and rocks. He moved at the pace that his knee permitted, which was not fast but was steady. The cabin appeared through the bare winter trees. He built a fire. He put water on for coffee. He sat on the porch in the winter cold and listened to the creek, which ran high and clear and cold and steady the way it had run for as long as anyone had been at this place to hear it. The collection room was empty now. The archival boxes were gone to their respective institutions. The flat drawers had been removed and transported carefully. The rifle pegs on the right wall held nothing. The propane climate control unit sat disconnected in the corner, having done its job for however many years Raymond had run it before Earl arrived. The room itself was still there, 20 feet by 20 feet. The shelving Raymond had built from dimensional lumber, carefully braced. The padded wooden table. The 3 heavy-gauge hasps on the door, their carriage bolts still solid in the wood. The room would become something else now, part of the research facility that the architects were planning. It would hold different things. But the care that had been taken with it, the thought behind it, had transferred to the new purpose the way knowledge transfers. Not by copying, but by informing. Earl sat on the porch until the light went. He thought about Raymond's note. "I'm sorry about everything. Mama too. 10 words of apology for 8 years of silence. But those 10 words had not been the real communication. The real communication was the envelope with the 3 keys in it. The climate control system running for years in a room in the mountains. The 19 pages of research notes on the crepe paintings. The receipt for $175 from the Rossman estate sale, kept in an acid-free sleeve and labeled and stored in the correct box on the correct shelf. That was the letter Raymond had written to him. It had taken 40 years to write, and Earl had received it exactly when he was meant to. He said out loud, "To the creek and the dark and whatever version of Raymond still occupied the space he had built. All right. I hear you." The creek kept running. A great horned owl called somewhere up the ridge, once, and then was quiet. He went inside and built up the fire and ate the last of the provisions he'd brought over on the morning crossing. He sat at the plank table with his coffee and opened the pocket notebook from his jacket pocket, the one he'd been filling for 4 months, and made a list of what still needed to be done. The list was long. There were meetings with the architects and the National Park Service in February. There were conversations still pending with 3 research universities about affiliate research programs. There were remaining items in the archival boxes still being cataloged by the Smithsonian staff that would need to be placed somewhere when the assessment was complete. He wrote the list in his small, precise handwriting, which was not Raymond's handwriting, which was not their father's handwriting, but which shared the same quality of legibility and care, because all 3 of them had been taught to write by the same woman in the same kitchen in Corbin, Kentucky, and she had insisted that writing was worth doing correctly. He looked at the list. He was 78 years old, with a piece of shrapnel in his left knee and a long list in front of him. He found he didn't mind either of those things. He had packed his bag that morning with the intention of driving back to Corbin after the crossing to begin sorting through the house on Maple Street, getting it ready to put on the market. There was a rental house in Murphy that Beverly had identified as suitable for the period when the foundation would need his presence regularly. The transition would take a few months. But first, before the driving and the sorting and the transitioning, there was one letter he needed to write. He got out a fresh piece of paper. He addressed it to Tommy Birch. He sat with the blank paper for a moment. He had been writing letters his whole adult life. In the Army, the official kind that used specific language in specific formats. After the Army, the personal kind to his parents and to Raymond and later to his children when they were young enough that letters from a parent carried weight. He had written the letter to Raymond in 2011 that he had not slept on and had always wished he could take back. He had been writing in this pocket notebook all year, which was not quite the same thing as letters, but was the same instinct. The need to put accurate words on paper and get them in the right order so that the record was correct. He thought about what Tommy Birch had said on the porch. I knew he was smart. You could feel it. The way he paid attention. The way he moved through this country. I just didn't know the shape of what it was. Tommy had lived 3 hours up the creek from the storage room for 30 years. He had seen Raymond's lights through the trees and talked to him on the trail and accepted coffee on the porch occasionally. He had known Raymond was doing something. He had not known what, because Raymond had not offered it and Tommy had not pushed, which Earl now understood as the correct instinct on both their parts. But Tommy had driven 3 hours to the funeral. He had sat in the back of First Baptist Church in Murphy on a gray February Tuesday and sat in his canvas coat with his back straight. He had been the only neighbor present. That mattered, and Earl wanted Tommy to know what he had been a neighbor to. He told Tommy what Raymond had built, beginning with the Virginia rifle in 1989 and going through to the 3 church paintings in the Sotheby's auction in October. He told him about the Hamilton letters in the Library of Congress and Raymond's name on the exhibition label at the Smithsonian. He told him about the boy of 10 who had asked his mother if the King's Mountain rifle was real. He told him, "Your neighbor spent 40 years doing something that must have looked from the outside like an old man driving back roads and stopping at estate sales. What he was actually doing was building something that will be standing long after both of us are gone. I thought you should know what you were living next to all those years. I thought Raymond would have wanted you to know." He sealed the envelope. He wrote Tommy's address on it. In the morning, he would cross back with Betty Sorrells and mail it in Murphy on his way to the highway. Then he would drive north to Corbin and begin putting his house in order. He banked the fire for the night, checked the water supply, and climbed up to the sleeping loft the way he had climbed it every night for 4 months, carefully, one rung at a time, the knee making its displeasure known and then subsiding. He lay on the mattress Raymond had left there, under the wool blanket Raymond had folded at the foot of it, in the cabin their father had built in 1947, and listened to the creak. He thought about what it meant to leave something behind. Not an estate, not a financial instrument, not a name on a building. The real kind of leaving behind. The work done across a whole life when nobody was watching. The thing built with whatever you had available, $14,000 and 40 years of careful Saturday drives. The particular knowledge that accumulates in a person who loves something enough to study it for a lifetime without needing anyone to see them doing it. Raymond had left him everything. Not money, though the money was also there. Everything. The proof that patient work sustained across a whole life produces something that efficient calculation cannot reach. The proof that knowing what you're looking for matters more than having resources to look. The proof that a man can spend 40 years building something alone in the mountains, and the thing he builds will be real, and will last, and will matter. And the moment it is handed to the right person, it will go out into the world and do what it was always meant to do. He had left Earl the keys at the right time. Earl had opened the door at the right time. That was Raymond's final piece of work, the timing. He closed his eyes. The creek ran below the cabin with the steady patience of something that did not need to be anywhere else. The fire in the stove made its ticking sounds. The owl on the ridge was quiet now. Earl Dawson went to sleep in the mountains of North Carolina, in the cabin his father built, on the property his brother had tended for 40 years, one room away from an empty room that had held, until recently, for $172 million worth of the things his brother had loved enough to keep properly. In the morning there would be a long drive ahead and a lot of work to do. He slept well. Tommy Birch called on a Tuesday in late January. Earl had moved into the Murphy rental house on Elm Street by then and was using a card table as a desk and a cot in the back bedroom, and had not yet arranged to have his furniture shipped from Corbin because there was always something more pressing. He recognized Tommy's voice immediately, the particular cadence of an older man from the Deep Creek country, the way the vowels settled differently than the Murphy townspeople Earl had been encountering since the move. Tommy said he had received the letter and had read it twice, and then put it down and walked outside and sat on his porch for an hour before he could think clearly enough to respond. He said, "I knew Raymond was doing something. You always know, with a man like that. You see the lights in a window, and you see the careful way he handles things and the way he pays attention, and you know there is a larger project involved. I just never would have guessed the shape of it." Earl said, "No, I don't think anyone would have." Tommy said, "He came by my place one October afternoon, maybe 4 years ago. He had been out at the cabin. He stopped on his way back to the crossing, and we sat on my porch for a while. He did not mention what he had been doing at the cabin, which was his right, and I did not ask. He talked about the watershed mostly, the way he always did. He knew things about that creek that I will never know in the time I have left, things that took a lifetime of paying attention to accumulate." He paused. He did say one thing, though. He said, "I hope I have organized it well enough that it makes sense to whoever comes after me." I thought he was talking about the trail notes he kept, the documentation of the watershed conditions. Earl said, "He had trail notes too." Tommy said, "Yes, but that is not what he meant." Earl sat at the card table with the phone held to his ear and looked at the bare wall of the rental house. He said, "No, that is not what he meant." Tommy was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I want you to know that what you wrote in that letter about him building something that will stand after both of us are gone is accurate. I have thought about it since I read it. A man who spends 40 years building something without needing anyone to see him do it is a rare thing. I did not fully understand what I was living next to, and I do not think I could have, given what I knew. But I respected him, and I am glad the right person came to receive what he left." Earl said, "He left the keys to the right person. That was his judgment, not mine." Tommy said, "He was a good judge of people. He always was." They spoke for another 20 minutes about the Hazel Creek watershed, about the water levels that winter, about the pair of river otters Tommy had seen working the shallows below the cabin site in late fall. Neither of them mentioned money. It did not seem like the relevant category. After the call, Earl sat at the card table for a while. He wrote Tommy's name and phone number in the pocket notebook he still carried in his jacket. He wrote it in the section he had started using for foundation contacts, which now ran to 14 pages. Then he wrote a note to himself. Talked to Beverly about NPS cooperative trail maintenance arrangement. Raymond's trail documentation as reference material. He set down the pen and looked at the wall. He thought about Raymond on Tommy Birch's porch in October, watching the creek, saying, "I hope I have organized it well enough that it makes sense to whoever comes after me." It had made sense. It had made the most specific kind of sense, the kind that accumulates across 40 years of careful work and then becomes fully legible only in the moment it is handed over. The architects came to the Hazel Creek site in early February, which was not the ideal time to assess a property requiring a boat crossing and a quarter-mile of Muddy Creek Trail, but the National Park Service's project timeline did not accommodate the ideal time, in Earl's experience, and neither had any other government-adjacent schedule he had encountered in his life. There were two of them. A principal named Susan Ye, 41, who ran a small firm in Asheville that had completed 2 previous projects in the Nantahala National Forest and had been selected by the NPS review panel specifically for that background, and her structural collaborator, a younger man named Marcus who carried his equipment in a pack and moved on the trail with the ease of someone who spent his weekends in terrain like this and did not treat it as a hardship. Betty Sorrells took them across in the morning and said nothing beyond collecting the crossing fee. Susan yet did not speak much on the trail. She looked at the site the way Janet Marsh had looked at the collection room. Systematically, with the specificity of someone trained to see past what the casual eye accepts as the full picture. She photographed the cabin exterior from 6 angles before she photographed anything else. She examined the roofline and the log joints and the covered breezeway connecting the main cabin to the storage room that would anchor the new research library addition. She knelt at the corner of the original cabin where the poplar logs met the footing stones and pressed her thumbnail into the wood and looked at it for a moment and said, "The original construction is in remarkable condition for its age. Someone has been maintaining the chinking and the sill logs consistently." Earl said, "Raymond." He kept it up. She nodded and moved to the storage room door. Earl opened the 3 padlocks. The room was empty now, but otherwise unchanged. The shelving still ran floor to ceiling on 2 walls. The padded wooden examination table sat in the center. The flat drawers were still braced in their frame on the right wall, the contents gone, but the frames themselves solid. The disconnected climate control unit sat in the corner where the Smithsonian team had left it. Susan Ye stepped into the doorway and looked at the room without entering it for a moment. Then she walked to the door frame and examined the 3 hasps, the carriage bolt placement, the door's thickness. Raymond had built it from 2-inch pine rather than the standard 1-inch, and had framed it to accommodate the weight. She ran her hand along the weather stripping on the interior face of the door frame, the kind with a foam backing designed to hold a seal through temperature swings. She said, "The person who built this understood what he was trying to achieve. He did not have the specialized materials a professional installation uses, but he understood the principles well enough to work around that." The climate record Beverly forwarded us shows the room maintained within 2 degrees Fahrenheit and 3% relative humidity of the target parameters for 6 consecutive years. Earl said. He read everything available on archival storage conditions. There were 5 books on the subject in his research files. She looked at the room a moment longer. She said, "We are going to design the addition so this room stays exactly as it is. The new facility will connect to it without altering the structure. The research library serves the functional purpose. This room is the origin point. It should stay that way." Earl had not asked her to do this. He said, "Yes, it should." Marcus measured and photographed, while Susan Ye sat on the breezeway steps with a large spiral pad and made notes. Earl stood on the cabin porch and watched the creek and let them work. He had not been back to the grave since February of the previous year, the morning after the funeral when he had stood in the parking lot and made an appointment with Pruitt rather than going to the graveside. The foundation work and the attorney meetings and the specialists and the move had filled the intervening months with the kind of continuous necessity that does not leave room for things that are only difficult and not also urgent. He went on a Wednesday afternoon in late February, approaching the 1-year mark. First Baptist Church's cemetery was on a hill east of town, old enough that the back sections held stones from the 1840s, leaning at the angles that ground expresses over a long period of time. Raymond's section was newer, closer to the access road, the grass around the markers still working itself in from the sod placed at the time of burial. The marker was flat granite, Forest Service gray, with a small circular emblem in the upper right corner. The Nantahala District Retirees Association had arranged and paid for it, which Earl had learned from Beverly in passing several months ago. The inscription said what Raymond would have approved of: Raymond Earl Dawson, 1944 to 2019, Nantahala National Forest, 31 years. Below it, a line that Earl had not known they were going to include. He understood this ground. Earl stood in front of it for a while, without speaking. He thought about the 13-year-old version of Raymond on the creek bank in 1963. The 13-year-old who had sat motionless for 2 hours watching a water thrush work the shallows, patient enough to become part of the creek's equation rather than a disruption to it. Their father had stopped on the bank on his way back from the equipment shed and looked at the boy for a moment and said, with a specificity that Earl had not recognized at the time as the highest compliment in his father's vocabulary, "That boy is the quiet kind of smart." He had said it about the patience. He had said it about the watching. He had said it about the specific intelligence that reveals itself not in what it announces, but in what it produces over time, without witnesses, without a scoreboard. He understood this ground. Yes, he did, Earl said, out loud, in the empty cemetery on a gray February afternoon. "I am working on it, Raymond. It is going to be right." The wind came through the ridge above and moved the dry grass at the base of the stones, and then subsided. A crow called somewhere in the hardwoods beyond the cemetery fence, and then was quiet. He stood a little longer. Then he walked back to the truck and drove back to the foundation office on Pine Street, and sat down at the table that served as his desk and opened the day's correspondence. The research affiliate program produced its first approved site visitor in March, just past the 1-year mark of Earl's first crossing with Betty Sorrells. Her name was Lien Ferris, 28 years old, a doctoral candidate from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, writing a dissertation on small arms production and distribution networks in the colonial Appalachian region. Her advisor had submitted the application through the university's formal affiliate agreement with the foundation. Beverly had reviewed the credentials and approved it, and the paperwork had been completed in 6 weeks, which Beverly considered reasonable for a government-adjacent process and which Earl considered reasonable for any process involving this many entities. Lien Ferris was the first person to come to the Hazel Creek site for a purpose other than assessment or construction planning. Every other visitor had come with a specific task and a departure time already established before they arrived. She was coming to study. That was a different category of presence. Earl crossed with her in the morning on Betty's boat. She carried a laptop and a camera and a notebook and a backpack that suggested she had thought carefully about what she needed and had not brought anything beyond it. She said very little on the crossing, which suited Earl. She looked at the far shore the way you look at a place you have been preparing yourself for. The collection room held no objects now. The Smithsonian retained the authenticated pieces for the exhibition period, and the Foundation archive held the documentation copies. What Lien Ferris was studying was the documentation itself, Raymond's research files, the acquisition records, the provenance chains he had assembled across 40 years. She had arranged with Beverly to work from the full copy set, which occupied 16 archival boxes in the Foundation archive and 3 additional boxes in the collection room for on-site reference. She set up at the padded wooden examination table and opened her laptop and began. Earl went to the porch. He had brought enough provisions for the day. He walked the creek trail in the morning at the pace his knee allowed, turned back at the bend where the big sycamore had fallen 2 winters ago and was still there across the trail, and came back to the cabin. He ate lunch on the porch step. The creek ran at its March level, higher than fall and lower than it would be after the spring rains. At mid-afternoon, Lena came out and asked if he had any coffee. He poured her a cup from the camp pot. She wrapped both hands around the mug and looked at the creek. She said, "His research methodology is extremely consistent. He is citing the same categories of primary sources in 1989 that he is citing in 2014. He updated his approach as digital archives became accessible, but the underlying standards did not change." She looked at the mug. Most private collectors who do their own provenance research either overclaim or underclaim. He does neither. He states exactly what he established and exactly what remained uncertain, and then he says why it remained uncertain. It makes him very easy to follow as a research subject. Earl said, "He was a careful man." She said, "More than that. He understood the difference between what he knew and what he believed. That distinction is harder to maintain than it sounds, especially when you care about something and you have spent years building a case for it. When he is writing about a piece he clearly cares about, You can feel the care in the notes, and then you see him pull back and write, "I believe this is what it is." The full determination belongs to someone more qualified. He never collapsed the two categories. Earl looked at the creek. He said, he knew what he was and what he was not. She said, yes. They drank their coffee. Below the porch the creek ran the way it had run since before anyone had been at this place to hear it. The water over the same rocks in the same channel, different water every moment, and the same creek across all of them. She went back inside and worked until 3, when Betty came across to collect them for the return crossing. On the boat, moving out over the flat gray reservoir, Lena Ferris looked back toward the tree line that concealed the trail and the cabin and the empty room behind its 3 locks. She said, "The first thing I can establish from his documentation is that he was still learning. His research at 65 is better than his research at 45. He kept improving his methods the entire time he was working." Earl said, "He was the patient kind." She nodded. She turned back toward the far shore and sat with the cold air coming off the water. After a moment, she said, "I will be back in April." He said, "The door will be open." 3 weeks after Lena Ferris's first visit, a letter arrived at the Pine Street office. It had been addressed to the Raymond Dawson Collection Foundation in handwriting that was unsteady in the way that very old handwriting sometimes is, not from incapacity, but from the accumulated weight of time in the joints of the hand. It came from a return address in Carter County, Tennessee, a town Earl had not heard of. The writer's name was Adeline Foss. She was 82. Her husband Martin had died the previous October, 41 years after they had married. Martin Foss had been, she wrote, a quiet man. He had worked for the county road department for 30 years and had spent his weekends and his vacation weeks driving the back roads of Carter County and the surrounding region, stopping at estate sales and old hardware stores and house cleanouts. He had brought things home. She had never interfered with what he was doing because it had been his work in the way that other people's work was their work, and she had respected that without entirely understanding it. The garage had accumulated boxes and wrapped items and flat wooden cases over 41 years. She had never been given a tour. He had not offered one, and she had not asked. Now Martin was gone, and she had 3 adult children, and none of them knew what to do with the garage. She had seen the article in the Asheville Citizen-Times about Raymond Dawson and the foundation. She had read it twice. She had put it on the kitchen table and walked past it for 3 days before she sat down and wrote the letter. She was not claiming that Martin's garage contained anything like what Raymond Dawson had assembled. She was not claiming anything at all. She was asking whether the foundation had any guidance for a widow in her situation, and she was asking specifically because the article had said Raymond Dawson had spent 40 years driving the back roads of the region, and Martin Foss had done the same thing. And she thought that perhaps the people who knew what Raymond had found might know something about the kind of person who spent a lifetime looking and what they tended to find. Earl read the letter twice. He set it on the desk and looked at it for a while. Then he picked up the phone and called Lena Ferris at the number she had left with the foundation. When she answered, he said, "I have a situation I think you should know about." He told her about the letter. He read the relevant parts word for word. He said, "I do not know what is in Martin Foss's garage, but I know the profile of a man who drove back roads for 40 years and kept what he found and organized it carefully enough that he knew where everything was and never told his wife what it was." Lena was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I would very much like to be part of whatever happens next." Earl said, "I thought you might." He pulled out the pocket notebook. He wrote Adeline Foss's name and address and the name of the town in Carter County, Tennessee, below Tommy Birch's entry. He wrote the date beside it. Then he wrote, "Follow-up. Martin Foss, 41 years, Carter County. Backroads." He looked at what he had written. He thought about Raymond, and then he thought about the particular kind of person who drives back roads on Saturdays for 40 years and keeps careful records of what they find. He thought about how many of them there might be out in the region, in the counties, in the valleys, and the creek hollows, each one doing what Raymond had done, alone and without an audience, building towards something that would need a witness eventually. He thought about what it might mean if the foundation was the place those things arrived. He closed the notebook. He was 78 years old, with a piece of shrapnel in his left knee and considerably more work to do than he had expected when he drove south from Corbin in February of the year before to sit in the back pew of First Baptist Church in Murphy and cry for his brother. He did not mind that either. He picked up the phone and called Beverly Cross.